Hello everyone, I am Mr. Midnight. I know many of you enjoy listening to these videos as you fall asleep. So before you drift off, I'd love for you to leave a comment letting me know where in the world you're tuning in from. And if you're enjoying the story, don't forget to like and subscribe. Alright, now let's get comfortable, relax, and dive into tonight's case. Story 1. The morning of June 9, 2020 began quietly on a patch of rural land in Fremont County, Idaho. A landscape defined by open sky, farmland, and the steady rhythms of agricultural life. Law enforcement vehicles rolled down a dirt drive toward a modest home owned by Chad Daybell, a self-published religious author known within a fringe doomsday-oriented community for his apocalyptic writings and spiritual visions. Officers carried search warrants that had been building for months, fueled by growing suspicion surrounding two missing children, 7-year-old Joshua, JJ, Vallow, and 16-year-old Tylee Ryan. By that afternoon, the quiet farmland would become the epicenter of one of the most disturbing criminal cases in recent American memory. The story had not begun in Idaho. It stretched back across state lines and through a web of religious extremism, fractured marriages, mysterious deaths, and increasingly delusional beliefs. At its center stood Lori Vallow, later known as Lori Vallow Daybell, a woman who had once been described by friends as charismatic, devoted, and deeply religious. By 2020, she would be described in very different terms. In September 2019, J.J. Vallow was last seen alive in Rexburg, Idaho. Tylee Ryan had last been seen weeks earlier during a family outing to Yellowstone National Park. At the time, their disappearances were not immediately reported to authorities. Lori Vallow had recently moved to Rexburg from Arizona with her children, reportedly to be closer to Chad Daybell, whom she had met through religious circles centered on apocalyptic prophecy and so-called spiritual preparedness. Both Lori and Chad had been married to other people when they met. Within months of their association, both of their spouses would be dead under suspicious circumstances. Chad Daybell's wife, Tammy Daybell, died suddenly in October 2019 in their Idaho home. Initially, her death was reported as natural causes. No autopsy was conducted at the time. Weeks later, Lori's estranged husband, Charles Vallow, had already been killed in Arizona in July 2019, shot by Lori's brother, Alex Cox, in what was described as self-defense. Charles had previously expressed concern about Lori's increasingly extreme religious beliefs and had told friends and authorities that she believed she was a translated being assigned to usher in the second coming of Christ. He had also warned that she had begun referring to certain individuals, including her own children, as dark or zombies, terminology that would later take on horrifying significance. After Charles's death, Lori collected life insurance money she believed she would receive, only to discover he had changed the beneficiary. Weeks later, she relocated with her children to Idaho. Chad Daybell's wife died soon after. Within 2 weeks of Tammy's death, Chad and Lori were married in Hawaii in November 2019. The speed of events drew scrutiny, especially when law enforcement in Idaho began asking questions about JJ's whereabouts. The case gained national attention in late November 2019 when officers conducted a welfare check for JJ at Lori's Rexburg apartment. Lori told police that JJ was staying with a friend in Arizona. That statement was false. By the next day, Lori and Chad had abruptly left Idaho. When investigators contacted the friend Lori had named, the friend denied having JJ. It was the first clear sign that something was profoundly wrong. Search efforts began, but Lori and Chad remained uncooperative. In December 2019, authorities publicly announced that both children were missing and that their parents were not assisting in locating them. Meanwhile, Tammy Daybell's body was exhumed in Utah for further examination as investigators began reassessing the circumstances of her death. Suspicion intensified as connections between the Arizona shooting, Tammy's sudden death, and the missing children became impossible to ignore. In February 2020, Lori Vallow was arrested in Hawaii on charges related to child desertion and non-support after failing to produce her children as ordered by an Idaho court. She was extradited back to Idaho in March 2020. Even then, she refused to disclose the location of JJ and Tylee. Chad Daybell, meanwhile, remained free in Idaho, publicly maintaining that the children were safe. As months passed, the absence of the children became more ominous. Investigators pieced together digital evidence, cell phone location data, financial transactions, and witness statements. They learned that Alex Cox's cell phone had pinged repeatedly near Chad Daybell's property in September 2019, shortly after Tylee was last seen. The data showed prolonged presence in the backyard area. Similar pings occurred around the time JJ disappeared. Alex Cox himself had died in December 2019 of what was ruled natural causes, removing a potentially critical witness. The digital trail became central to the investigation. Law enforcement analysts reviewed thousands of messages exchanged between Lori, Chad, and Alex. The communications reflected an increasingly radical worldview centered on apocalyptic timelines, spiritual rankings, and designations of individuals as possessed or spiritually dark. Within that belief system, death was framed not as murder, but as liberation from a corrupted body. Investigators would later argue that these beliefs provided ideological justification for what had happened to the children. By early June 2020, the accumulation of digital evidence, combined with witness accounts and inconsistencies in Lori's statements, led authorities to seek a search warrant for Chad Daybell's property. On June 9, officers began excavating sections of the backyard, identified through cell phone mapping and forensic analysis. What they found confirmed the worst fears of investigators and the public. In one area of the yard, partially concealed in a pet cemetery, officers uncovered the remains of a body later identified as JJ Vallow. His remains were wrapped in plastic and bound with duct tape. In another area, buried deeper and more extensively concealed, they discovered charred and dismembered human remains later, identified as Tylee Ryan. The condition of the remains indicated attempts at burning and destruction of evidence. That same day, Chad Daybell was taken into custody. He was observed leaving the property during the search and was arrested without incident. Prosecutors would later charge both Chad and Lori with multiple counts including conspiracy, murder, and grand theft, related to Social Security benefits collected after the children's deaths. The discovery transformed the case from a missing persons investigation into a confirmed double homicide. The rural Idaho property became a symbol of calculated concealment and ideological extremism. For months, Lori had remained silent while insisting publicly that the children were safe. The grim reality uncovered in the backyard contradicted every assurance she had given. As the legal process moved forward, investigators began untangling the broader pattern of deaths surrounding the couple. Tammy Daybell's exhumation results became critical. Charles Vallow's shooting was re-examined. Financial motives emerged alongside religious ideology, including continued collection of benefits tied to the children after their deaths. Prosecutors alleged that Lori and Chad had conspired not only to kill the children, but also to profit financially and remove perceived spiritual obstacles to their relationship. The case exposed a dangerous intersection of apocalyptic belief systems, manipulation, and escalating violence. It revealed how fringe religious narratives, when fused with personal ambition and emotional detachment, could create a closed reality in which murder was reframed as divine necessity. By the end of 2020, Lori Vallow Daybell and Chad Daybell were both formally charged in connection with the children's deaths. The nation watched as preliminary hearings unfolded, revealing chilling text messages and testimony from friends who described Lori's gradual transformation from devoted mother to someone who spoke calmly about her children being gone, in a spiritual sense. The Idaho farmland where the children were found became not just a crime scene, but a stark reminder of how deception can persist behind ordinary appearances. Neighbors had seen nothing outwardly alarming. The house looked like any other in the rural community, yet beneath the soil lay evidence of one of the most disturbing family crimes of the decade. The discovery of JJ and Tylee's remains marked the end of hope and the beginning of a prolonged legal reckoning. The investigation was far from over. Autopsy findings, digital forensic analysis, and witness testimony would continue to shape the prosecution's case. And as 2020 drew to a close, the country grappled with the realization that 2 children had been killed within a web of ideology, secrecy, and calculated planning that had unfolded in plain sight. This was only the beginning of the courtroom battle that would follow. The days following June 9, 2020 were marked by a shift in tone from desperate hope to prosecutorial precision. Once the remains of J.J. Vallow and Tylee Ryan were confirmed on Chad Daybell's property in Fremont County, Idaho, investigators moved swiftly to solidify the legal structure of a case that had been building quietly for months. What had once been framed publicly as a missing persons investigation was now unmistakably a homicide case, and prosecutors began constructing formal charges that reflected the gravity of what had been uncovered beneath the soil of a seemingly ordinary rural backyard. Chad Daybell was arrested the same day the remains were found. He was initially charged with felony counts of destruction, alteration, or concealment of evidence. Bail was set at a high amount, effectively ensuring he would remain in custody. Lori Vallow Daybell, who had already been in jail since February 2020 for child desertion and non-support, now faced the collapse of the narrative she had maintained for months, that her children were safe and being protected. That claim was no longer defensible. In the weeks that followed, autopsy examinations were conducted on the recovered remains. JJ's body had been wrapped tightly in plastic and secured with duct tape. Tylee's remains were found burned and dismembered, indicating deliberate attempts to destroy forensic evidence. The medical examiner's findings became central to the prosecution's theory that the deaths were intentional, premeditated, and concealed with calculated effort. As investigators dug deeper into digital records, the role of Alex Cox, Lori's brother, became increasingly significant. Though Alex had died in December 2019 from what authorities ruled natural causes, his cell phone data placed him repeatedly at Chad Daybell's property during key timeframes in September 2019. Location pings showed him in the backyard on September 9, the day after Tylee was last seen alive following the family's trip to Yellowstone National Park. His phone remained in the vicinity for several hours. Similar data placed him near the property again on September 23, shortly after JJ was last seen. Prosecutors would later argue that these visits were not coincidental. The digital timeline suggested that Alex had physically transported the children's bodies and assisted in burial efforts. Text messages between Chad and Lori during that period added further context. In one message sent on September 9, Chad texted Tammy Daybell about shooting a raccoon in the backyard and burying it in the pet cemetery. That explanation would later be viewed as an attempt to create a plausible reason for disturbed soil in that area. Tammy Daybell's death, initially classified as natural causes in October 2019, became a focal point as well. Her body had been exhumed in December 2019, and by mid-2020, authorities were reevaluating the circumstances of her sudden death. Witnesses later testified that Tammy had appeared healthy prior to her passing. Friends described her as active and engaged in daily life. The proximity between her death and Chad's rapid remarriage to Lori in November 2019 intensified suspicion. By late June 2020, prosecutors formally charged both Lori and Chad with conspiracy to commit destruction, alteration, or concealment of evidence. Additional charges would follow. The Fremont County Prosecutor's Office, working alongside Madison County authorities, began consolidating the case into a comprehensive prosecution strategy that encompassed not only the children's deaths, but also financial crimes tied to Social Security benefits. Lori had continued collecting after both JJ and Tylee were dead. Court hearings during the summer of 2020 revealed more details. Investigators presented evidence that Lori had continued receiving and spending federal benefits allocated for JJ and Tylee months after their disappearances. Bank records showed transactions consistent with normal living expenses, contradicting any suggestion that the funds were being held for the children's care elsewhere. The financial component added another layer to the prosecution's case, suggesting motive beyond ideological belief. Public reaction intensified as more details emerged. National media outlets focused on the unusual religious beliefs shared by Lori and Chad. Chad had authored multiple self-published books centered on near-death experiences and apocalyptic prophecies. Within certain religious fringe circles, he claimed to have spiritual gifts allowing him to rate individuals as light or dark spirits and to foresee future events. Testimony from former associates described gatherings where discussions of possession, zombies, and spiritual missions were treated as literal realities rather than metaphor. According to witness accounts later presented in court proceedings, Lori had embraced these ideas fully. She allegedly told friends that her children had become dark spirits and that their physical bodies no longer contained their true souls. Investigators argued that such beliefs were used to rationalize homicide as a spiritual necessity. As summer turned to fall in 2020, the case expanded beyond Idaho. In Arizona, law enforcement reopened the investigation into the shooting death of Charles Vallow. Initially ruled self-defense based on Alex Cox's statements, new evidence suggested the possibility of premeditation. Prosecutors examined text messages and statements indicating that Lori had expressed a desire to be free from Charles prior to his death. Insurance policies were scrutinized. Friends and family members were interviewed again, this time within the broader context of a pattern of suspicious deaths. The web of fatalities surrounding the couple was now impossible to ignore. Charles Vallow in July 2019, Tammy Daybell in October 2019, JJ and Tylee in September 2019, and Alex Cox in December 2019. Each death had initially been explained as self-defense, natural causes, or coincidence. Together, they formed a sequence that prosecutors believed pointed to coordinated action. In August 2020, a grand jury in Idaho indicted Lori Vallow Daybell on felony charges including conspiracy to commit destruction or concealment of evidence. Chad Daybell faced similar charges. The indictment signaled that the case was moving beyond preliminary hearings and into full criminal prosecution territory. Bail remained high, and both defendants stayed in custody. Court proceedings also began addressing the issue of mental competency. Lori's behavior in court drew attention. At times she appeared detached, smiling, or unconcerned as charges were read. Her demeanor fueled speculation about her psychological state. Defense attorneys began preparing for potential arguments related to competency and mental health. The prosecution, meanwhile, emphasized calculated behavior, the relocation to Hawaii, the refusal to cooperate with police, and the financial transactions conducted after the children's deaths. As the months progressed, prosecutors continued to build a digital narrative of conspiracy. Thousands of text messages between Lori and Chad were analyzed. In those messages, they referred to themselves as exalted beings with divine missions. They discussed timelines for apocalyptic events and framed the removal of certain individuals as part of a larger spiritual plan. The language oscillated between affectionate romantic exchanges and strategic discussions about obstacles that needed to be addressed. By late 2020, the charges were expanded. Both Lori and Chad were formally charged with first-degree murder in connection with the deaths of JJ and Tylee, along with conspiracy to commit murder. Chad also faced a charge related to Tammy Daybell's death. The severity of the charges reflected the prosecution's position that the killings were deliberate, planned, and motivated by both ideology and personal gain. The legal strategy on both sides began to crystallize. Prosecutors aimed to demonstrate that religious belief did not excuse criminal conduct, and that the defendants had used apocalyptic rhetoric as camouflage for calculated homicide. The defense signaled that mental state would be a central issue, particularly regarding Lori. Meanwhile, families of the victims continued to speak publicly about their grief. Kay and Larry Woodcock, JJ's grandparents, had been among the first to raise alarm when they were unable to reach him in late 2019. Their persistence had triggered the welfare check that ultimately unraveled the case. For them, the discovery of JJ's body brought devastating confirmation, but also validation that their concerns had been justified. As 2020 closed, the groundwork for what would become one of the most closely watched criminal trials in recent years was firmly in place. The farmland search had answered the question of where the children were. The next question, why and how, would be addressed through months of motions, hearings, and evidentiary battles. The narrative that had begun with missing children had evolved into a prosecution alleging ideological extremism fused with financial motive and intimate conspiracy. The quiet Idaho property had yielded physical evidence. Now the courtroom would determine responsibility. The legal process was only accelerating. By the beginning of 2021, the case against Lori Vallow Daybell and Chad Daybell had shifted from investigation to procedural warfare. Prosecutors in Idaho were no longer piecing together what had happened. They were preparing to prove it beyond a reasonable doubt. The indictments handed down in 2020 were expanded through a grand jury process in 2021, elevating the charges to include first-degree murder and conspiracy to commit murder in connection with the deaths of J.J. Vallow and Tylee Ryan. Chad Daybell was also formally charged with first-degree murder in the death of his wife, Tammy Daybell. The legal weight of those charges marked a decisive moment. First-degree murder in Idaho carries the possibility of the death penalty. Soon after the grand jury indictment, Fremont County prosecutors announced they would seek capital punishment against Chad Daybell. The state argued that the murders were especially heinous and involved multiple victims. Lori Vallow Daybell's case would follow a slightly different trajectory due to emerging concerns over her mental competency. Court proceedings in 2021 revealed the depth of the prosecution's digital and forensic evidence. Investigators outlined a timeline built from cell phone data, financial records, and text messages. Alex Cox's device had been tracked with striking precision. On September 9, 2019, the morning after Tylee was last seen alive, Cox's phone placed him at Chad Daybell's property for approximately 2.5 hours. The device registered movement consistent with being in the backyard. On September 23, 2019, the day after JJ was last seen alive, Cox's phone again pinged at the property, remaining there for hours. Chad Daybell's text message to Tammy on September 9 about shooting a raccoon and burying it in the pet cemetery was introduced in court filings as a key piece of circumstantial evidence. Prosecutors would argue that the message was an attempt to create an explanation for disturbed earth, where Tylee's remains were later found. The burial sites corresponded closely with the cell phone location data. Autopsy findings were also discussed in greater detail during pretrial proceedings. J.J. Vallow's cause of death was later determined to be asphyxiation. He had been bound with duct tape, including tape over his mouth. Tylee Ryan's remains were so severely burned and dismembered that a precise cause of death could not be definitively established, but the manner of death was ruled homicide. The condition of her remains indicated deliberate attempts to conceal and destroy evidence. While the Idaho case advanced, developments in Arizona began running parallel. The death of Charles Vallow, shot by Alex Cox in July 2019, had initially been treated as self-defense. However, by 2021, Arizona authorities represented the case to a grand jury. In 2021, Lori Vallow was indicted in Maricopa County on charges of conspiracy to commit first-degree murder in connection with Charles Vallow's death. Prosecutors alleged that she and Alex Cox had planned the killing in advance. The expanding web of charges across state lines reinforced the prosecution's narrative. This was not a series of isolated incidents, but an interconnected pattern of deaths tied to Lori and Chad's relationship and belief system. Amid these escalating legal actions, Lori's mental health became a pivotal issue. In May 2021, an Idaho judge ruled that Lori Vallow Daybell was not competent to stand trial. Court-ordered psychological evaluations concluded that she was unable to assist in her defense. As a result, her criminal proceedings in Idaho were paused, and she was committed to a state psychiatric facility for treatment aimed at restoring competency. The ruling introduced a significant delay into the Idaho case. While Chad Daybell's case continued moving forward independently, Lori's proceedings were effectively suspended. Legal observers noted that competency rulings do not equate to findings of insanity at the time of the crime. Rather, they address a defendant's present ability to understand proceedings and participate in their defense. Throughout late 2021, periodic updates were filed with the court regarding Lori's condition. The facility reported ongoing treatment efforts. The pause frustrated some family members of the victims who were eager for trial, but competency restoration is a constitutional requirement. The court emphasized that due process demanded that Lori be mentally fit before facing trial. Meanwhile, prosecutors continued preparing the capital case against Chad Daybell. Pretrial hearings addressed evidence admissibility, witness lists, and the logistical complexity of a death penalty prosecution. The state argued that Chad had played a central leadership role in promoting the apocalyptic ideology that justified the killings. They intended to present testimony from former associates who would describe his claims of spiritual authority and his system of labeling individuals as light or dark. Witness statements suggested that Chad had described certain people, including Tylee, JJ, Tammy, and Charles, as having been overtaken by dark spirits. According to testimony previewed in court documents, he had assigned numerical death percentages to individuals, allegedly indicating the likelihood that they would die soon. Prosecutors argued that this rhetoric served as both psychological manipulation and premeditation. Financial evidence also continued to play a role. Lori had collected Social Security survivor benefits on behalf of JJ and Tylee after Charles Vallow's death. Payments continued even after the children were killed. Bank records showed expenditures on rent, travel, and personal expenses during the period when the children were no longer alive. The state framed this as grand theft and as evidence of motive. In 2022, Lori Vallow Daybell was deemed competent to stand trial after treatment. The Idaho court reinstated criminal proceedings against her. Shortly thereafter, new indictments added charges related to Tammy Daybell's death, alleging that Lori had conspired with Chad to commit murder in that case as well. The prosecution's theory evolved into a comprehensive conspiracy. Lori and Chad had sought to eliminate spouses and children who stood in the way of their relationship and shared apocalyptic mission. The consolidation of charges significantly increased the scope of the upcoming trial. Prosecutors now intended to present evidence covering multiple deaths across different states, connected by digital communication and ideological alignment. Defense attorneys faced the daunting task of countering not only forensic evidence, but also a narrative that portrayed the defendants as driven by a radicalized belief system. Courtrooms in Idaho saw repeated motions regarding venue changes due to intense media coverage. The case had drawn national attention, with extensive reporting on the bizarre religious elements and the tragic fate of the children. Judges weighed concerns about ensuring an impartial jury against the logistical challenges of relocation. As 2022 progressed, Chad Daybell's case remained separate and on a capital track. Lori's case, though once delayed, was now positioned to proceed first. Prosecutors announced that they would not seek the death penalty against Lori, distinguishing her case from Chad's. The strategic decision meant that Lori would face life imprisonment rather than capital punishment if convicted. The separation of the trials altered courtroom strategy. Each defendant would be tried independently, allowing the prosecution to tailor arguments and evidence presentation. It also meant that testimony given in one trial could influence public perception ahead of the other. By late 2022, jury selection preparations were underway for Lori's Idaho trial. The charges she faced included first-degree murder for the deaths of JJ and Tylee, conspiracy to commit murder, grand theft related to benefits payments, and conspiracy in the death of Tammy Daybell. The prosecution's case would rely heavily on digital forensics, witness testimony from former friends and religious associates, and the physical evidence recovered from Chad's property. The years since the children were last seen had been filled with procedural complexity, but the central facts remained stark. 2 children were dead, buried in a backyard. A spouse had died suddenly. Another spouse had been shot, and a network of apocalyptic beliefs had framed the narrative around those deaths. As the courtroom phase approached in earnest, the question was no longer whether the children had been killed. The remains had answered that. The question now was whether prosecutors could convince a jury that Lori Vallow Daybell and Chad Daybell had deliberately conspired to bring about those deaths under the guise of divine mission and spiritual warfare. The stage was set for testimony that would lay bare private messages, belief systems, and the unraveling of a family under the weight of extremism and secrecy. The trial phase was about to begin. By early 2023, the long-anticipated courtroom reckoning began in earnest. After years of investigation, motions, competency evaluations, and grand jury indictments, Lori Vallow Daybell stood trial in Fremont County, Idaho. The charges against her were extensive. First-degree murder in the deaths of her children, JJ Vallow and Tylee Ryan. Conspiracy to commit murder in connection with those deaths. Grand theft related to the collection of Social Security benefits after the children were dead, and conspiracy to commit murder in the death of Tammy Daybell. Jury selection reflected the extraordinary publicity surrounding the case. Potential jurors were questioned extensively about media exposure and preconceived opinions. The court sought individuals who could evaluate evidence objectively despite years of national coverage. Once seated, the jury would hear weeks of testimony detailing not only how the children died, but the belief system prosecutors argued had fueled the conspiracy. The state's case was methodical and heavily data-driven. Prosecutors began by reconstructing the timeline of September 2019. They presented cell phone location data from Alex Cox, showing his device at Chad Daybell's property on September 9 and September 23. Dates corresponding closely with the last confirmed sightings of Tylee and JJ. The jury saw maps with precise ping coordinates, establishing that Cox's phone remained in the backyard for extended periods. Testimony from law enforcement officers described the June 9, 2020 search of Chad's property and the discovery of the burial sites. Photographs and forensic evidence were introduced. JJ's remains had been wrapped in plastic and bound with duct tape, including tape placed over his mouth. The medical examiner testified that JJ died from asphyxiation. Tylee's remains, found burned and dismembered, were so severely damaged that an exact cause of death could not be determined, but the manner was ruled homicide. The condition of her body indicated deliberate attempts at destruction and concealment. Prosecutors also introduced extensive text messages exchanged between Lori and Chad. In those messages, the pair referred to individuals in their lives as light or dark, language tied to Chad's claimed spiritual abilities. Witnesses from their religious circle testified that Chad had asserted he could determine when a person had been overtaken by a dark spirit, describing such individuals as zombies. According to testimony, both JJ and Tylee had been labeled dark before their deaths. Financial records were laid out in detail. After Charles Vallow's death in July 2019, Lori received Social Security survivor benefits on behalf of JJ and Tylee. Payments continued even after September 2019, when both children were no longer alive. Bank statements showed routine spending, rent, travel, personal expenses, during months when Lori was publicly claiming the children were safe, but refusing to produce them. The prosecution argued that the motive combined ideology and financial benefit. Lori and Chad wanted to be together without the responsibilities of children or spouses, and they used their apocalyptic belief system to justify eliminating those they considered obstacles. Witness testimony included friends who described Lori's transformation in 2019. They recounted conversations in which she spoke calmly about her children no longer being themselves, suggesting their souls had left their bodies. Some witnesses testified that she seemed detached, even cheerful, in the weeks after the children disappeared. One former friend described Lori dancing on a beach in Hawaii shortly after marrying Chad, while the children were already dead. The defense faced significant challenges. Lori's attorneys did not present a traditional insanity defense. Instead, they sought to cast doubt on whether Lori had directly participated in the killings, suggesting that Alex Cox may have acted independently. They emphasized the absence of direct physical evidence placing Lori at the burial sites. However, prosecutors countered with conspiracy law. Direct physical participation was not required if the jury found that she knowingly agreed to and facilitated the murders. Notably, Lori did not testify in her own defense. Throughout the trial, observers commented on her courtroom demeanor, often described as composed and at times smiling. The jury was instructed to focus solely on evidence presented. In May 2023, after deliberating for several hours, the jury returned guilty verdicts on all counts in Idaho. Lori Vallow Daybell was convicted of first-degree murder in the deaths of JJ and Tylee, conspiracy to commit murder in their deaths, and conspiracy to commit murder in the death of Tammy Daybell. She was also convicted of grand theft for unlawfully collecting benefits. The verdict marked a decisive moment in a case that had spanned multiple states and years of investigation. During sentencing in July 2023, the judge imposed multiple life sentences without the possibility of parole. In court, the judge described the crimes as the ultimate betrayal of maternal responsibility. Family members delivered victim impact statements, speaking of the joy JJ and Tylee had brought into their lives and the devastation caused by their loss. While Lori's Idaho case concluded with life imprisonment, her legal battles were not entirely over. In Arizona, she still faced charges related to the death of Charles Vallow. In 2024, she was extradited to Arizona to stand trial for conspiracy to commit first-degree murder in connection with Charles's shooting. Those proceedings remain part of the broader legal aftermath of the case. Meanwhile, Chad Daybell's case moved separately through Idaho's capital trial process. In 2024, Chad Daybell was tried for the murders of JJ, Tylee, and Tammy Daybell. Prosecutors sought the death penalty, arguing that he had been a central architect of the conspiracy and had directly benefited from Tammy's life insurance policy. The trial mirrored much of the evidence presented in Lori's case, but included additional testimony specific to Tammy's death. In May 2024, Chad Daybell was convicted on all counts, including first-degree murder and conspiracy. The jury subsequently recommended the death penalty. The court formally sentenced him to death under Idaho law. The sentencing underscored the state's view of the crimes as calculated, premeditated, and especially egregious. The case that began with a welfare check in late 2019 had concluded with 2 murder convictions, 1 death sentence, multiple life sentences, and ongoing proceedings in Arizona. It exposed the lethal consequences of insular belief systems fused with personal ambition and manipulation. It also demonstrated the power of digital forensics, cell phone pings, text messages, and financial records to reconstruct events even when physical evidence had been buried or burned. For the families of J.J. Vallow and Tylee Ryan, the verdicts provided legal closure, though not emotional resolution. Their grandparents, Kay and Larry Woodcock, whose insistence on a welfare check set the investigation in motion, remained outspoken advocates for the children's memory. Tylee's extended family similarly emphasized her independence, intelligence, and resilience, qualities overshadowed in headlines by the circumstances of her death. The rural property in Fremont County, Idaho, once an unremarkable stretch of land, became permanently associated with the crime. The case entered public consciousness as a stark example of how extremist beliefs, unchecked and reinforced within a closed circle, can escalate into violence. What unfolded between 2019 and 2024 was not a sudden eruption but a progression: ideological radicalization, relational secrecy, financial maneuvering, and finally lethal action. The courts ultimately determined that these deaths were not accidents, not acts of self-defense, and not divine inevitabilities. They were crimes, planned and carried out within a conspiracy that left 4 people dead and families permanently fractured. The legal system's response: meticulous investigation, competency evaluation, separate trials, and sentencing, reflected the gravity and complexity of the case. And while appeals and related proceedings may continue for years, the central judicial findings stand. J.J. Vallow and Tylee Ryan were murdered, their deaths concealed beneath Idaho soil, and those responsible have been held criminally accountable. The story that began with missing children ended in a courtroom, with verdicts that closed one of the most disturbing chapters in recent American criminal history. Story 2. On the morning of June 14, 2020, inside a high-rise apartment in Bandra, Mumbai, a call was placed that would ignite one of the most intense criminal investigations and media frenzies in modern Indian history. Actor Sushant Singh Rajput, 34 years old, was found hanging in his bedroom by his house staff. The news traveled quickly, first as shock, then as disbelief, and finally as a national storm that would not subside for months. Within hours, television channels were broadcasting from outside the Mont Blanc building. Crowds gathered. Social media erupted. What began as a report of an apparent suicide would evolve into a multi-layered investigation involving allegations of abetment, financial misconduct, drug procurement, and institutional conspiracy. Sushant Singh Rajput had risen from modest beginnings in Patna to become one of Bollywood's most recognizable young actors. His journey from television to film had been marked by commercial successes and critical acclaim. To the public, he was talented, intelligent, and ambitious. But by mid-2020, reports suggested he had been struggling with mental health issues. According to early statements from Mumbai police, Rajput had been undergoing treatment for depression. Prescriptions and medical documents were reportedly found at the residence. Initial assessments indicated no signs of forced entry or physical struggle. The Mumbai police began their inquiry the same day. Standard procedure required recording statements from individuals present in the apartment, including house staff and close associates. According to initial accounts, Rajput had locked his bedroom door from inside. When he did not respond to repeated knocks, a locksmith was called. After the door was opened, he was found hanging from a ceiling fan using a cloth. The police registered an accidental death report under Section 174 of the Criminal Procedure Code, which is customary in cases of apparent suicide. Within days, statements were recorded from friends, industry colleagues, and his then-partner, actress Rhea Chakraborty. Investigators examined call records, electronic devices, and medical history. The post-mortem was conducted at Cooper Hospital in Mumbai, and the preliminary report stated the cause of death as asphyxia due to hanging. No external injury marks consistent with assault were reported in the initial findings. However, the narrative did not remain confined to a straightforward suicide investigation. The timing of the death, during the COVID-19 lockdown, when much of the country was already under psychological strain, amplified public emotion. Online discussions rapidly transformed into allegations of professional isolation, nepotism in the film industry, and potential foul play. Hashtags trended for weeks. Television debates turned accusatory. By late June 2020, Rajput's father, Krishna Kumar Singh, filed a first information report in Patna, Bihar, alleging that Rhea Chakraborty and her family had financially exploited his son and abetted his suicide. The FIR accused her of transferring large sums of money from Rajput's accounts and of isolating him from his family. This filing marked a major jurisdictional shift. While the death had occurred in Mumbai and was being investigated by Mumbai police, Bihar police now initiated a parallel investigation based on the complaint filed there. The move triggered a legal dispute over jurisdiction. Bihar police officers traveled to Mumbai to pursue the allegations. Tensions between the two state police forces became publicly visible. Soon after, the Enforcement Directorate, ED, entered the case to probe allegations of money laundering related to financial transactions between Rajput and Chakraborty. Bank statements were scrutinized. Reports suggested that forensic accounting was underway to determine whether funds had been misappropriated. In early August 2020, amid escalating public pressure, the Supreme Court of India intervened. It directed that the Central Bureau of Investigation, CBI, would take over the probe into Rajput's death. The ruling effectively transferred primary investigative authority from Mumbai police to the CBI, consolidating the case at the central level. The CBI registered its own FIR against Rhea Chakraborty and others, including charges related to abetment of suicide and criminal conspiracy. By this point, the case had expanded beyond the circumstances of death. The Narcotics Control Bureau, NCB, initiated a separate investigation into alleged drug procurement linked to Rajput and his associates. WhatsApp chats recovered from electronic devices reportedly indicated discussions about marijuana and other substances. The NCB arrested several individuals, including Rhea Chakraborty and her brother Shoak Chakraborty, under provisions of the Narcotic Drugs and Psychotropic Substances Act. Rhea was taken into custody in September 2020 and later granted bail by the Bombay High Court. As agencies multiplied, so did the layers of inquiry. The CBI team conducted forensic analysis, recreated the crime scene, examined medical reports, and questioned witnesses repeatedly. A team from the All India Institute of Medical Sciences was tasked with reviewing the post-mortem findings to assess whether there were inconsistencies or signs of homicide. Months passed as forensic opinions were awaited. The public discourse, meanwhile, grew more polarized. Television studios conducted nightly debates. Competing narratives emerged, one asserting institutional failure and murder, another emphasizing mental health and the dangers of speculative accusation. Social media platforms became battlegrounds of theory and counter-theory. Amid the noise, the formal investigative process continued, methodical and largely silent. By late 2020, the AIIMS forensic team reportedly concluded that the cause of death was consistent with suicide and that there was no evidence of homicide. The CBI continued examining angles related to alleged abetment, financial exploitation, and conspiracy, but no conclusive evidence of murder was publicly announced during that year. The case had evolved from a tragic death into a national spectacle involving multiple central agencies, interstate jurisdictional conflict, financial investigation, narcotics enforcement, and intense media scrutiny. It exposed fissures in public trust, questions about mental health stigma, and the volatile interplay between celebrity, politics, and criminal law. As 2020 closed, the investigation remained technically ongoing. Charges had been filed in related financial and narcotics cases. Bail orders had been contested and granted. Public attention had not diminished. What began inside a locked bedroom in Mumbai had rippled outward into courtrooms, investigative headquarters, and millions of Indian households. The official question at the heart of the case: whether Sushant Singh Rajput's death was a suicide or the result of criminal conspiracy, had become entangled in competing narratives. Yet beneath the emotion, agencies continued compiling forensic data, financial records, and witness testimony, preparing for legal conclusions that would carry lasting consequences. This was only the beginning of the legal and investigative maze that would unfold over the next several years. As the Central Bureau of Investigation formally assumed control of the case in August 2020, the tone shifted from televised confrontation to procedural reconstruction. The agency began by registering a fresh fur that mirrored many of the allegations made by Sushant Singh Rajput's father in Patna, including abetment to suicide, criminal conspiracy, and financial misconduct. A special investigation team was formed, and officers arrived in Mumbai to begin what was described as a scientific re-examination of the circumstances surrounding June 14. The CBI's first priority was to secure and analyze physical evidence from the apartment in Bandra. Though the Mumbai police had already conducted an initial investigation, the CBI team revisited the crime scene to document the layout, examine furniture placement, and assess the structural mechanics of the alleged hanging. They consulted forensic experts to evaluate the height of the ceiling fan, the type of cloth used, and whether the position of the body was consistent with suicidal hanging. The agency also collected electronic devices, including laptops, hard drives, and mobile phones, to retrieve deleted data and examine communication patterns in the days leading up to the death. Simultaneously, the Enforcement Directorate intensified its probe into financial transactions. Bank statements from multiple accounts were scrutinized to determine whether funds had been siphoned without consent. The ED examined payments made to companies allegedly associated with Riya Chakraborty and reviewed expenditures on travel, household expenses, and professional services. Public speculation suggested large transfers of money, but investigators worked through transaction records line by line. According to statements made during court proceedings, the ED sought to determine whether any financial benefit had been derived unlawfully or whether spending patterns were consistent with shared living arrangements. Meanwhile, the Narcotics Control Bureau's investigation into alleged drug procurement broadened. WhatsApp chats retrieved from electronic devices were presented as evidence of conversations referencing marijuana and other substances. The NCB summoned several individuals connected to the film industry for questioning. In September 2020, Riya Chakraborty was arrested under the Narcotic Drugs and Psychotropic Substances Act on charges related to procurement of small quantities of cannabis, allegedly for Rajput's consumption. Her brother, Shoaik Chakraborty, was also arrested. The NCB's case focused not on the cause of death, but on violations of narcotics laws, yet its proceedings further intensified public scrutiny. Riya Chakraborty's arrest marked a turning point in media coverage. Television cameras followed the convoy transporting her to the NCB office. Debates escalated into accusations. Supporters argued that she was being unfairly targeted. Critics insisted the arrest validated suspicions of wrongdoing. After nearly a month in judicial custody, she was granted bail by the Bombay High Court, which observed that the charges pertained to alleged procurement of small quantities and did not, at that stage, establish a broader trafficking network. Within the CBI's domain, investigators interrogated dozens of witnesses, including household staff, friends, doctors, talent managers, and psychiatrists. Medical records were reviewed to confirm whether Rajput had been undergoing treatment for depression and anxiety. Prescriptions and therapy notes were examined to assess continuity of care and compliance with medication. The agency sought clarity on whether there had been signs of suicidal ideation prior to June 14. A significant development came when a forensic panel from the All India Institute of Medical Sciences was tasked with reviewing the autopsy report conducted at Cooper Hospital. Questions had circulated publicly about ligature marks and alleged inconsistencies in the post-mortem documentation. The AIIMS panel reviewed photographic evidence, viscera reports, and medical notes. By late 2020, reports indicated that the panel found no evidence of homicide and concluded that the cause of death was consistent with hanging. The panel reportedly ruled out strangulation. Despite this forensic opinion, the CBI did not immediately close its investigation. The agency continued examining the abetment angle under Section 306 of the Indian Penal Code, which requires proof that an individual instigated or intentionally aided suicide. Investigators analyzed messages between Rajput and Riya Chakraborty to determine whether there was coercion, harassment, or deliberate psychological manipulation. They also reviewed statements from Rajput's family, who maintained that he had been isolated and emotionally distressed. Jurisdictional tensions that had characterized the early weeks of the case gradually subsided as the Supreme Court's directive solidified the CBI's authority. However, the broader ecosystem of agencies remained active. The ED continued tracing financial flows, and the NCB filed charge sheets in narcotics-related matters involving multiple accused individuals. Each agency operated within its statutory mandate, but public perception often conflated their roles. By the end of 2020, the narrative had grown more complex than the original incident. What began as an apparent suicide investigation had expanded into parallel cases concerning financial conduct and drug procurement. Yet the central question, whether there had been criminal abetment, remained under review. The CBI reportedly reconstructed the sequence of events inside the apartment on June 14. According to witness accounts, Rajput had been awake that morning, had requested fruit juice, and had closed his bedroom door afterward. The locksmith's statement regarding the locked door was re-examined. Forensic specialists assessed whether the door could have been manipulated externally. Call detail records from the days preceding the death were analyzed to map communication frequency and duration. The CBI examined whether there had been heated exchanges or signs of distress in messages. The agency also evaluated statements suggesting that Rajput had been concerned about his career trajectory and public perception. Friends described periods of enthusiasm and intellectual curiosity, alongside episodes of withdrawal. As 2020 concluded, the CBI had not publicly announced a final determination regarding abetment or conspiracy. The ED's investigation into alleged money laundering continued, with summons issued to financial advisors and accountants. The NCB pursued prosecutions under narcotics law, filing formal complaints in court. The case had become emblematic of how a single death could trigger layered investigations across multiple legal domains. It also revealed the interplay between public opinion and criminal procedure. While agencies operated under evidentiary standards, public discourse often moved faster, driven by speculation and televised debate. In legal terms, the burden remained on investigators to establish intentional instigation if abetment charges were to be sustained. Mere presence in a relationship or shared financial arrangements would not suffice. The CBI's extended inquiry signaled the difficulty of proving psychological coercion absent explicit documentation. As months turned into years, the case remained open within the CBI's docket. Periodic status updates were filed in court when petitions were submitted seeking closure or further action. The Supreme Court's earlier involvement underscored the constitutional dimension of jurisdiction and investigative fairness. For Rajput's family, the continued investigation represented a pursuit of accountability. For the accused, the prolonged process meant sustained legal uncertainty. For the public, the case had already reshaped conversations about mental health, media conduct, and the boundaries between suspicion and evidence. The developments of late 2020 did not bring immediate resolution. Instead, they laid the groundwork for extended legal proceedings that would continue beyond the year, including petitions in higher courts, scrutiny of agency findings, and debates over transparency. The initial shock of June 14 had transformed into a prolonged legal saga. The apartment in Bandra was no longer merely a scene of tragedy. It had become the focal point of an investigation spanning state lines, central agencies, and multiple branches of criminal law. The next phase would depend on whether investigators could convert their findings into prosecutable conclusions, or whether the case would ultimately be defined by the absence of evidence supporting conspiracy. The story was no longer just about how a life ended. It was about whether the criminal justice system could definitively answer the questions that had gripped a nation. As 2021 began, the intensity of nightly television debates began to recede, but inside investigative offices and courtrooms, the case remained active. The Central Bureau of Investigation continued examining digital evidence, forensic reports, and witness statements collected over the previous months. Although public discourse had centered heavily on theories of homicide, the agency's work moved within the narrower legal framework of whether there was evidence to sustain charges of abetment to suicide or criminal conspiracy. The AIIMS forensic panel's conclusion that the death was consistent with suicidal hanging had narrowed the homicide angle significantly. This finding did not automatically resolve the matter, but it placed a heavier burden on investigators pursuing alternative theories. The CBI reportedly conducted further interviews with forensic doctors from Cooper Hospital, clarifying procedural questions raised during public debate about ligature marks and post-mortem documentation. The agency also reviewed video recordings and photographs taken at the scene to ensure that its reconstruction aligned with the medical findings. Parallel to this, the Enforcement Directorate continued its financial inquiry. Bank accounts belonging to Sushant Singh Rajput and Riya Chakraborty were examined for unusual withdrawals or suspicious transfers. Investigators assessed expenditures related to property rent, travel, staff salaries, and professional services. Public allegations had suggested misappropriation of large sums, but the ED's role required tracing documented transactions rather than relying on speculation. Statements were recorded from accountants and financial advisors to determine whether funds had been transferred without consent or whether they reflected shared financial management during a live-in relationship. The Narcotics Control Bureau, meanwhile, filed charge sheets in its drug-related case. The NCB alleged that certain individuals, including Riya Chakraborty and her brother, had been involved in procuring small quantities of cannabis. The case extended beyond the immediate circle to include other industry figures questioned about drug consumption. Courts evaluated bail applications, and legal arguments focused on the distinction between personal consumption and trafficking under the Narcotic Drugs and Psychotropic Substances Act. The Bombay High Court's earlier decision granting bail emphasized that at that stage, the allegations pertained to procurement of limited quantities and did not establish involvement in a larger network. Within the CBI's investigation, the abetment angle remained complex. Section 306 of the Indian Penal Code requires proof of intentional instigation or active assistance in suicide. The agency examined text messages between Rajput and Chakraborty, as well as communications with friends and family members. Investigators assessed whether there was evidence of coercion, sustained harassment, or deliberate manipulation that could meet the legal threshold for abetment. Psychological autopsy techniques were reportedly employed, reviewing behavior patterns, emotional states, and external stressors in the weeks leading up to June 14, 2020. Statements from psychiatrists and doctors who had treated Rajput were evaluated to understand his mental health condition. According to reports presented in court filings, he had been prescribed medication for depression and anxiety. The continuity of treatment, adherence to medication, and progression of symptoms became part of the analytical framework. The CBI sought to determine whether his mental health trajectory suggested internal distress rather than external instigation. Throughout 2021, petitions were filed in various courts seeking updates or closure of the investigation. Some petitioners argued that the prolonged probe without public conclusion created uncertainty and speculation. Others requested transparency regarding forensic findings. The CBI, as is customary, maintained that investigations were ongoing and that disclosure would occur upon completion or filing of a closure report or charge sheet. Media scrutiny did not disappear entirely. Occasional developments reignited discussion, particularly when court hearings in related cases occurred. However, the intensity of coverage diminished compared to the immediate aftermath of the death. The case transitioned from a spectacle-driven narrative to a procedural one, unfolding largely within legal filings and investigative memoranda rather than primetime debates. By 2022, attention turned toward whether the CBI would file a final report. Under Indian criminal procedure, if investigators conclude that no evidence supports prosecution, they may submit a closure report before a magistrate. Alternatively, if sufficient evidence exists, a charge sheet is filed initiating trial. Observers closely monitored whether the agency would determine that abetment charges were sustainable. Meanwhile, the Enforcement Directorate's money laundering investigation required establishing that proceeds of crime had been generated through scheduled offenses. Without a predicate offense such as proven criminal breach of trust or cheating, sustaining money laundering charges becomes legally challenging. Court hearings reflected arguments over whether financial transactions constituted unlawful gain or ordinary expenditure within a consensual relationship. The Narcotics Control Bureau case proceeded through the standard judicial process, with hearings addressing admissibility of digital chats and the evidentiary value of electronic communication under the Evidence Act. Defense attorneys argued that casual conversations referencing substances did not automatically establish criminal conspiracy to traffic narcotics. Prosecutors maintained that procurement and facilitation fell within statutory prohibitions. For Sushant Singh Rajput's family, the extended timeline remained emotionally charged. They continued to express dissatisfaction with early investigative handling and sought definitive answers. Supporters organized online campaigns demanding transparency. However, within the legal framework, agencies were bound by evidentiary standards rather than public sentiment. By late 2022 and into 2023, reports began to indicate that the CBI had substantially completed its investigation. Forensic analyses, financial audits, call detail record examinations, and witness depositions had been consolidated. The AIIMS panel's earlier opinion ruling out homicide remained a significant anchor point. The central unresolved question was whether the evidence met the threshold required to establish intentional abetment. Throughout this period, the broader national conversation shifted toward mental health awareness. Discussions emerged about the impact of public scrutiny, professional pressure, and online harassment on individuals in high-visibility careers. Some commentators argued that the case highlighted the need for responsible media conduct during active investigations. Others emphasized the importance of thorough inquiry when allegations of foul play arise. Legally, the case illustrated the complexity of proving psychological causation in suicide. Establishing that a person's actions directly instigated another's death requires clear evidence of intent and active encouragement. Emotional conflict within a relationship, by itself, is generally insufficient under criminal law. As procedural steps continued, the CBI faced the challenge of balancing transparency with investigative confidentiality. Court-monitored updates ensured oversight without compromising ongoing analysis. The Supreme Court's earlier order transferring the case had underscored the importance of impartiality and credibility in high-profile investigations. By the time 3 years had passed since the events of June 14, 2020, the immediate shock had faded, but the legal file remained active. Agencies had invested extensive resources examining every angle: medical, financial, digital, and interpersonal. The case had traversed local police inquiry, interstate jurisdictional conflict, central agency takeover, narcotics prosecution, and financial scrutiny. What began as a death investigation evolved into a multi-agency examination of personal relationships, mental health, financial conduct, and alleged drug use. Yet the legal outcome depended not on the breadth of inquiry, but on the strength of admissible evidence. The final chapter would depend on whether the CBI filed a closure report or a charge sheet, and how the courts responded to its conclusions. Until that moment, the case remained suspended between allegation and adjudication, shaped by both forensic documentation and the enduring weight of public expectation. As the investigation moved into its fourth year, the question that had hovered over the case since June 14, 2020, whether Sushant Singh Rajput's death involved criminal conspiracy or abetment, approached a formal legal resolution. The Central Bureau of Investigation, after examining forensic evidence, medical records, financial transactions, digital communications, and witness statements, reached the stage where it had to decide whether sufficient evidence existed to prosecute or whether the matter would conclude with a closure report. By 2023 and into 2024, multiple petitions were filed before courts seeking clarity on the status of the investigation. Some petitioners demanded updates from the CBI, while others requested transfer or monitoring. The agency, consistent with investigative protocol, did not publicly disclose internal findings until its analysis was complete. However, reports emerging from legal proceedings indicated that the homicide angle had effectively been ruled out based on forensic consensus. The opinion of the AIIMS panel, that the death was consistent with suicidal hanging and not strangulation, remained central to that determination. The CBI's task was then narrowed to whether abetment under Section 306 of the Indian Penal Code could be established. Legally, abetment requires clear evidence that an accused intentionally instigated, aided, or conspired in the act of suicide. Emotional distress within a relationship, disagreements, or financial disputes do not automatically satisfy this threshold. Investigators reviewed text messages, emails, psychiatric consultations, and testimony from individuals close to Rajput during the final months of his life. The agency examined whether there was documentation of coercion, threats, or deliberate psychological manipulation directed towards self-harm. Financial allegations were also subjected to evidentiary scrutiny. The Enforcement Directorate's inquiry into possible money laundering depended on demonstrating that proceeds of crime existed. Bank transaction analyses, which had been examined extensively over several years, were assessed in light of whether any scheduled offense had been substantiated. Without proof of criminal breach of trust, cheating, or misappropriation, sustaining money laundering charges becomes legally untenable. Court hearings reflected arguments over whether expenditures were part of shared domestic arrangements or constituted unlawful diversion. The Narcotics Control Bureau's separate prosecution regarding alleged procurement of cannabis continued through standard judicial processes. Charge sheets had been filed, and courts evaluated the admissibility of digital chats and the sufficiency of evidence regarding procurement. Bail granted earlier by the Bombay High Court remained in effect, and the narcotics case proceeded independently of the death investigation. By early 2025, reports indicated that the CBI had finalized its findings. According to information presented in court proceedings, the agency concluded that there was no evidence supporting homicide and no prosecutable evidence establishing abetment to suicide or criminal conspiracy in relation to Sushant Singh Rajput's death. A closure report was submitted before the competent court, outlining the investigative steps taken and the evidentiary conclusions reached. The report reportedly relied heavily on forensic medical opinion, digital record analysis, and the absence of documentary proof of instigation. Under Indian criminal procedure, a closure report does not automatically end a matter. The magistrate reviewing it may accept the report, reject it, or direct further investigation. The court examines whether the investigative findings are supported by material evidence. As part of due process, notice may be given to the complainant to respond to the closure report. For Rajput's family, the submission of a closure report marked a significant legal moment. They retained the right to challenge the findings or seek further judicial review. Public reaction was divided. Some observers viewed the report as a confirmation of the forensic conclusion reached earlier by the AIIMS panel. Others expressed dissatisfaction, arguing that the years of investigation had not addressed every concern raised in the immediate aftermath of the death. Legally, however, the criminal justice system operates on evidentiary standards rather than public sentiment. The absence of proof sufficient to sustain charges under Sections 302 or 306 of the Indian Penal Code meant that prosecution could not proceed. In criminal law, suspicion, however strong, cannot substitute for admissible evidence establishing guilt beyond reasonable doubt. The Enforcement Directorate's financial case, lacking a predicate-scheduled offense, faced similar legal limitations. Without an underlying crime, the foundation for money laundering prosecution weakens considerably. Court proceedings reflected this challenge, and the focus gradually shifted away from the dramatic allegations that had dominated headlines in 2020. The narcotics case remained procedurally distinct. While its allegations concerned procurement of small quantities of cannabis, they did not legally establish causation in Rajput's death. Courts evaluating that matter focused strictly on statutory compliance and evidentiary admissibility under the NDPS Act. By the time the CBI's closure findings were placed before the judiciary, nearly 5 years had passed since the initial incident. The arc of the case had stretched from an accidental death report filed by Mumbai police to Supreme Court intervention, transfer to the CBI, forensic review by AIIMS, financial inquiry by the Enforcement Directorate, narcotics prosecution by the NCB, and multiple petitions in higher courts. Few criminal investigations in recent Indian history had involved such layered institutional participation. The broader social impact of the case remained significant. It sparked debate about mental health awareness, media responsibility during ongoing investigations, and the risks of trial by television. It also highlighted the legal complexity of proving abetment to suicide, particularly in cases involving personal relationships and psychological vulnerability. The apartment in Bandra where Sushant Singh Rajput was found became a symbolic site in public memory, representing both personal tragedy and national controversy. For supporters and critics alike, the years-long process underscored how celebrity cases can blur the line between legal procedure and public spectacle. In the end, the formal conclusion rested on forensic science and statutory interpretation rather than conjecture. The AIIMS panel's determination of suicide by hanging stood uncontradicted by credible medical evidence. The CBI's examination did not yield prosecutable proof of instigation or conspiracy. Courts reviewing the closure report would ultimately determine whether the investigative findings were accepted as final. The case that began on June 14, 2020, evolved into one of India's most scrutinized investigations. It traversed jurisdictional conflict, multiple central agencies, and years of legal analysis. Yet its resolution, grounded in forensic evaluation and evidentiary standards, returned to the central fact established at the outset: a death by hanging in a locked bedroom, without demonstrable proof of homicide or criminal abetment. For the family, friends, and admirers of Sushant Singh Rajput, legal closure does not equate to emotional resolution. The questions of personal struggle, mental health, and public pressure remain part of the narrative. But within the framework of criminal law, The case reached its endpoint through procedural examination rather than dramatic revelation. What unfolded over these years was not only a criminal investigation, but also a reflection of how modern India processes tragedy in the age of instant communication. Agencies pursued every documented lead. Courts exercised oversight. Allegations were tested against evidence. And in the end, the judiciary became the final arbiter of what could and could not be proven in a court of law. Story 3. On July 5, 2020, in a residential complex in Hangzhou, Zhejiang Province, a woman disappeared from her apartment during the night. At first, the absence appeared puzzling but not immediately violent. There were no signs of forced entry, no reports of a struggle heard by neighbors, and no clear indication of conflict. The woman, surnamed Lai, lived with her husband, Su Gyuali, in a high-rise building. According to her husband, she had left the apartment in the early hours wearing a nightgown and had not returned. The statement would later unravel under forensic scrutiny, but in those first hours, it set the narrative that investigators would initially evaluate. The woman's disappearance was reported to local police after family members were unable to contact her. Surveillance footage from the residential compound was examined. Cameras captured individuals entering and exiting the building, but none showed Lai leaving the premises after the time her husband claimed she had departed. The absence of footage was a crucial early anomaly. If she had left the building, she would likely have appeared on at least one camera. The failure to locate such footage shifted the investigative lens inward, toward the apartment itself. Hangzhou police launched a large-scale search operation. Hundreds of officers, search dogs, drones, and divers were mobilized. Lakes, rivers, parks, and nearby transportation hubs were combed. Notices were circulated. The case attracted public attention as the scale of the search expanded. Su Gyuali gave interviews to local media, appearing calm and cooperative. He described his wife as stable and denied any recent conflict. His demeanor did not immediately raise suspicion, but investigators continued to question inconsistencies in his account. Inside the apartment, forensic teams conducted a detailed examination. No visible bloodstains were apparent. Surfaces appeared clean. Furniture was undisturbed. However, forensic analysis does not rely solely on visible traces. Chemical reagents were used to detect latent blood evidence. Floors, drains, and plumbing systems were inspected. The investigation began to consider whether a crime had occurred within the residence despite the absence of overt signs. Meanwhile, attention turned to the building's sewage system. In a high-rise structure, wastewater from individual apartments flows through a shared pipeline before reaching municipal treatment facilities. Investigators collected samples from septic tanks and drainage channels connected to the building. The decision was methodical, reflecting a suspicion that if a body had been destroyed or dismembered within the apartment, traces might remain in the plumbing infrastructure. The breakthrough came when forensic technicians identified biological tissue fragments within the sewage system. Subsequent DNA analysis confirmed that the material matched Lai's genetic profile. The discovery transformed the case from a missing person investigation into a confirmed homicide. The scale of concealment became apparent. The victim had not left the building. She had been killed inside it. Police detained Su Gyuali shortly after the forensic confirmation. Under interrogation, he eventually confessed to killing his wife during the night of July 4-5. According to court findings later presented, the killing followed a domestic dispute related to property and financial matters. The couple reportedly had disagreements regarding real estate allocation and family arrangements. The dispute escalated fatally. The method of concealment shocked the public. Su Gyuali admitted to dismembering the body inside the bathroom of the apartment. Using tools available within the household, he fragmented the remains and disposed of portions through the toilet over an extended period, flushing tissue into the building's drainage system. Larger fragments were reportedly packaged and discarded. The act required prolonged effort and deliberate planning. He then cleaned the apartment thoroughly in an attempt to eliminate evidence. Investigators reconstructed the timeline. Surveillance footage showed Su leaving the building multiple times in the days following the disappearance, carrying bags. He claimed these outings were routine, but the timing coincided with the disposal of evidence. Forensic teams spent weeks extracting and analyzing material from the sewage treatment facility connected to the residential complex. Tons of sludge were examined to recover human tissue fragments sufficient for identification. The public response in China was intense. The case spread rapidly across social media platforms. The contrast between Su's calm media appearances and the brutality described in the confession fueled widespread outrage. Commentators noted how the crime had occurred within a densely populated urban environment without immediate detection. The methodical nature of the dismemberment and disposal deepened public shock. As the investigation progressed, prosecutors prepared formal charges of intentional homicide. Chinese criminal law treats premeditated and especially cruel murders with severity, often permitting capital punishment. Authorities emphasized that the killing involved extreme means of concealment and deliberate destruction of the body to obstruct justice. The court proceedings began later in 2020 at the Hangzhou Intermediate People's Court. Evidence presented included DNA analysis from the sewage system, forensic reconstruction of the apartment scene, surveillance footage of Su's movements, and his confession. Prosecutors argued that the act was premeditated and driven by financial dispute. They described how Su had killed Lai while she was asleep, minimizing resistance and maximizing control. Defense arguments focused on mitigating factors, though details were limited in public reporting. In cases involving confession, Chinese courts often examine whether the defendant cooperated and whether remorse was demonstrated. However, the brutality and concealment method weighed heavily in judicial assessment. By July 2020, within weeks of the disappearance, the suspect had been arrested. By 2021, the trial concluded with a conviction for intentional homicide. The court sentenced Su Guoli to death, citing the especially cruel nature of the crime and the severe social impact. The judgment noted that the method of killing and body disposal reflected extreme malice and calculated effort to evade detection. The case became one of the most discussed criminal cases in China that year, not only for its violence, but for the forensic perseverance required to uncover it. Without visible blood or eyewitnesses, investigators relied on plumbing systems, sewage analysis, and genetic testing to establish the crime. The recovery of DNA from wastewater infrastructure demonstrated the expanding capabilities of forensic science in urban environments. What began as a missing person report had evolved into a homicide investigation defined by meticulous concealment and equally meticulous detection. The apartment that appeared undisturbed had concealed a violent act executed in the quiet of night. The drainage pipes beneath the building held the evidence that ultimately dismantled the suspect's narrative. The story did not end with the initial conviction. Under Chinese law, death sentences are subject to review by the Supreme People's Court before execution. The appellate process would determine whether the sentence was upheld. The case's legal journey continued beyond the initial verdict, reinforcing the procedural steps required even in crimes that provoke overwhelming public condemnation. This was only the beginning of the full legal reckoning that followed. In the days following the confirmation that biological remains recovered from the sewage system belonged to Lai, investigators intensified their reconstruction of what had occurred inside the apartment during the night of July 4 into the early hours of July 5, 2020. By then, the public narrative had shifted entirely. The disappearance was no longer treated as a possible voluntary departure. It was now a confirmed homicide committed within a residential building in Hangzhou. Police sealed the apartment for extended forensic examination, and technical teams continued to dismantle the illusion that the crime scene had been effectively cleaned. The bathroom became the central focus. Although no visible blood pooled on the tiles, forensic luminol testing revealed traces consistent with diluted biological fluids. Drain covers were removed. Plumbing traps were opened. Microscopic fragments of tissue were collected from pipe interiors. Investigators documented tool marks on bathroom surfaces and examined cutting instruments recovered from the residence. While public disclosures did not enumerate every instrument used, court findings later confirmed that Su Guoli had used household tools to dismember the body after killing his wife. Interrogation transcripts, as summarized in court proceedings, indicated that the killing occurred while Lai was asleep. Prosecutors argued that Su had chosen a time when she would be defenseless. The motive, according to the prosecution, centered on ongoing disputes related to property ownership and financial arrangements. The couple had previously been married to other partners and had children from earlier marriages. Allocation of real estate assets reportedly became a source of tension. Investigators examined bank accounts, property deeds, and prior communications to understand whether the homicide had been premeditated. Surveillance footage from the residential compound proved crucial in contradicting Su's original claim that his wife had left the apartment on her own. Cameras documented his movements over several days following the disappearance. He was seen exiting the building carrying bags at different times, returning empty-handed. Prosecutors would later argue that these movements corresponded with stages of body disposal. Although much of the remains were flushed through the plumbing system, other materials required external disposal. One of the most labor-intensive elements of the investigation involved the municipal sewage treatment facility connected to the building. Authorities deployed workers to sift through sludge and waste. Reports indicated that tons of sewage were examined manually and mechanically. The process was physically demanding and prolonged. Workers wore protective gear and sorted debris under forensic supervision. Their objective was to recover sufficient human tissue to establish identity and confirm the method of disposal. DNA extraction from wastewater presents technical challenges, yet the forensic laboratories succeeded in isolating viable samples that matched Lai's genetic profile. As details emerged, public reaction intensified. Su Guoli had appeared in media interviews during the early days of the search, speaking calmly about his missing wife and urging authorities to find her. That footage, replayed repeatedly after his arrest, became emblematic of the deception. Online commentary in China focused heavily on his composure and the contrast between his outward demeanor and the brutality described in investigative findings. The case was widely discussed as an example of concealed domestic violence escalating into calculated murder. During interrogation, Su eventually admitted to killing his wife. According to court summaries, he described strangling her during a late-night dispute. After confirming her death, he proceeded to dismember the body in the bathroom. The concealment process extended over many hours. He reportedly worked methodically, cutting the body into smaller pieces to facilitate disposal. Portions were flushed through the toilet. Larger sections were packaged and removed from the apartment. Afterward, he cleaned the bathroom thoroughly to eliminate visible traces. Investigators analyzed water usage data from the apartment. Utility records indicated unusually high water consumption during the relevant period. Prosecutors used this data to support the reconstruction of prolonged flushing activity consistent with body disposal. The plumbing infrastructure of the building was examined to determine how material traveled from the apartment to shared septic tanks and onward to the treatment facility. The technical reconstruction became a central pillar of the prosecution's case. In addition to forensic evidence, digital data played a role. Police reviewed Su's phone records, search history, and communications before and after the homicide. Publicly reported court findings did not disclose every detail, but authorities emphasized that evidence showed calculated effort to conceal the crime, rather than a spontaneous attempt to report an accident or seek help. His behavior after the killing, giving interviews, participating in searches, and maintaining a composed public posture, was interpreted by prosecutors as deliberate misdirection. By late July 2020, the case had moved formally into the prosecutorial phase. The People's Procuratorate reviewed the evidence and approved arrest on charges of intentional homicide. Under Chinese criminal law, intentional killing carries severe penalties, especially when the method is deemed particularly cruel or when the social impact is significant. The concealment and dismemberment of the body were cited as aggravating factors. The indictment described the crime as premeditated and malicious. It argued that Su had chosen to eliminate his wife over financial disputes rather than resolve them legally. Prosecutors highlighted the calculated concealment, including attempts to mislead police and the public. The scale of the subsequent investigation, hundreds of officers, forensic teams, and sewage workers, was presented as evidence of the crime's severe social disruption. The Hangzhou Intermediate People's Court scheduled hearings in late 2020. Due to intense public interest, courtroom access was limited. Proceedings focused on forensic findings, confession details, surveillance footage, and expert testimony. Forensic specialists explained how DNA was extracted from sewage sludge. Plumbing engineers testified about the feasibility of flushing human remains through a residential system and the time required. Utility experts discussed water usage patterns consistent with prolonged disposal efforts. The defense acknowledged the killing but sought leniency, reportedly arguing that the act arose from domestic conflict rather than calculated long-term planning. In Chinese criminal adjudication, confession and cooperation can influence sentencing. However, prosecutors maintained that the degree of cruelty and concealment outweighed any mitigating factors. In July 2021, the court delivered its verdict. Su Guoli was found guilty of intentional homicide. The judgment emphasized the particularly cruel means of killing and disposal, as well as the deliberate attempt to obstruct investigation. The court sentenced him to death and deprivation of political rights for life. The written decision underscored that the crime had caused severe social harm and public outrage. Under Chinese law, death sentences must undergo mandatory review by the Supreme People's Court. This review examines legal correctness, evidentiary sufficiency, and procedural integrity. The appellate stage ensured that the conviction met national judicial standards. While public details of the review process were limited, the sentence was ultimately upheld. The case's impact extended beyond the courtroom. It prompted widespread discussion about domestic disputes, property conflicts in blended families, and the challenges of detecting concealed violence within private spaces. It also highlighted advancements in forensic science, particularly the ability to identify human remains within municipal waste systems. What began as a missing person report evolved into a forensic case study in concealment and detection. The apartment in Hangzhou, outwardly ordinary, became the epicenter of one of China's most shocking criminal investigations of 2020. Beneath tiled floors and through drainage pipes, evidence persisted despite deliberate efforts to erase it. The legal process had moved from disappearance to confession, from sludge recovery to death sentence. Yet the full reckoning of motive, psychological dynamics, and societal response would continue to unfold in public discourse long after the courtroom judgment. Following the July 2021 death sentence handed down by the Hangzhou Intermediate People's Court, the case entered the mandatory review stage required for all capital punishments in China. Under national procedure, every death sentence must be examined and approved by the Supreme People's Court in Beijing before it can be carried out. This safeguard is designed to ensure evidentiary sufficiency, procedural correctness, and proportionality of punishment. Although the public rarely receives detailed insight into this review, it represents a critical final checkpoint in capital cases. In the case of Su Guoli, The lower court had concluded that the killing of his wife in July 2020 constituted intentional homicide carried out with particularly cruel means. The court emphasized not only the act of killing, but the post-mortem dismemberment and prolonged disposal through the plumbing system of the residential building in Hangzhou. It characterized the concealment as deliberate obstruction of justice and noted the extreme social impact caused by the crime. These aggravating factors were central to the capital sentence. During the appellate review phase, legal authorities reassessed the confession, forensic evidence, surveillance records, expert testimony, and procedural integrity of the investigation and trial. In China, the Supreme People's Court does not typically conduct a new public trial, but instead evaluates the documentation and legal reasoning submitted from the lower courts. The review ensures that the facts were clearly established, that evidence was lawfully obtained, and that the sentence aligns with statutory standards for crimes deemed exceptionally severe. Public reporting later confirmed that the Supreme People's Court upheld the death sentence. The approval signaled that the central judicial authority agreed with the lower court's assessment. The crime involved extreme cruelty, calculated concealment, and significant social harm. Following approval, execution can be carried out in accordance with national law, typically by lethal injection. Reports in early 2023 indicated that the sentence had been carried out after final review. Beyond the legal resolution, the case remained embedded in public discourse long after the formal proceedings concluded. The sheer methodical nature of the concealment, dismemberment in a bathroom, flushing remains through a toilet, and extended cleaning efforts had shocked many across China. The fact that the crime occurred within a densely populated urban residential complex without immediate detection prompted discussions about how violence can remain hidden within private domestic spaces. Much commentary focused on the early media interviews given by Su during the initial search period. Footage showed him speaking calmly to reporters, expressing concern for his missing wife, and encouraging authorities to find her. In retrospect, that composure was widely interpreted as calculated misdirection. Analysts noted that such public participation in search efforts has appeared in other high-profile cases globally, where perpetrators attempt to deflect suspicion by appearing cooperative. The juxtaposition of those interviews with later revelations intensified public reaction. Forensic aspects of the investigation also received significant attention. The decision to inspect the sewage system proved decisive. Once surveillance footage failed to show the victim leaving the building, investigators concentrated on internal possibilities. The examination of plumbing infrastructure, septic tanks, and municipal sludge was physically grueling and technically complex. Workers reportedly sifted through large volumes of waste material to recover tissue fragments sufficient for DNA analysis. The successful identification demonstrated the expanding capabilities of forensic science in urban criminal investigations. Water usage records from the apartment became another focal point in post-trial analysis. Elevated water consumption during the period following the killing supported the prosecution's reconstruction of extended flushing activity. Combined with DNA evidence and confession details, these data points formed a coherent evidentiary chain. Observers noted that modern infrastructure, surveillance cameras, digital records, and utility monitoring can both mask and expose criminal acts depending on investigative interpretation. The case also reignited debate about domestic conflict escalation. According to court findings, disputes over property distribution played a role in the motive. The couple had prior marriages and children from earlier relationships. Property ownership and inheritance arrangements in blended families can become contentious, especially in rapidly urbanizing cities where real estate values have risen sharply. While financial disputes alone do not predetermine violence, commentators examine how unresolved tension combined with secrecy and resentment can escalate into fatal outcomes. Legal scholars analyzing the case pointed to the court's emphasis on particularly cruel means and severe social impact in justifying capital punishment. Chinese criminal law allows for severe penalties in cases involving extreme brutality or concealment designed to evade detection. The dismemberment and attempt to eliminate evidence were central to the judicial reasoning. Courts frequently distinguish between spontaneous acts of violence and those involving calculated post-crime mutilation or obstruction. In this case, the prolonged and methodical disposal process weighed heavily against the defendant. Public interest persisted partly because the crime unfolded during 2020, a year already marked by global disruption and heightened anxiety. High-profile domestic cases often resonate more strongly during periods of social stress. The image of a seemingly ordinary apartment concealing a calculated homicide unsettled many. The investigation's revelation that human remains could be traced through plumbing systems underscored how modern cities contain hidden networks capable of preserving forensic traces, even when visible surfaces appear clean. The victim, often referred to in media simply by surname Lai, became the focal point of memorial discussions. Online commentary emphasized the vulnerability of individuals within intimate relationships and the importance of recognizing warning signs in domestic disputes. Although details of prior conflict were not extensively publicized, the eventual confession established that lethal violence followed arguments related to financial arrangements. The case was cited in broader conversations about conflict resolution and the risks of unresolved domestic tension. As years passed, the case remained a reference point in Chinese discussions about forensic innovation and criminal concealment. Training materials and media retrospectives highlighted how investigative persistence, particularly the decision to examine wastewater systems, proved decisive. It demonstrated that attempts to erase evidence through physical destruction do not guarantee success when scientific methods can recover microscopic traces. The finality of the death sentence closed the legal chapter, but did not erase the psychological impact left on the community. Residents of the building where the crime occurred had lived unknowingly above and below the scene of dismemberment. Interviews conducted after the arrest reflected shock that such an act could unfold without detection in a shared environment. It reinforced awareness that severe crimes may occur behind ordinary doors, hidden by routine and silence. By the time the execution was reported, the judicial process had spanned several years from disappearance to final punishment. Each stage from missing person report to sewage recovery, confession, trial, appeal, and execution revealed layers of procedural structure within China's criminal justice system. The case had moved methodically through investigation, prosecution, adjudication, review, and enforcement. Yet even with legal closure, broader implications continued to circulate. Discussions about domestic violence prevention, dispute mediation, and community awareness persisted in public commentary. The crime's notoriety ensured that it would be remembered not only for its brutality, but for the forensic path that uncovered it. The story, however, does not end with the execution. The final dimension lies in understanding how the investigation unfolded step by step in those critical first weeks, how suspicion narrowed, and how a narrative built from fragments of sludge dismantled a carefully constructed lie. That deeper reconstruction completes the arc of what happened inside that apartment in July 2020. In the earliest hours after Lai was reported missing in July 2020, the situation did not yet resemble one of the most shocking homicide cases in recent Chinese memory. It began with uncertainty, confusion, and a husband's explanation that seemed plausible on the surface. According to the account given by Su Guoli, his wife had left the apartment in the middle of the night. She was said to have walked out quietly, wearing a nightgown, taking little with her. There were no immediate signs of forced entry, no neighbors reporting screams, and no visible evidence of violence in the shared hallways of the high-rise building in Hangzhou. The story might have remained a missing persons mystery if not for a series of incremental inconsistencies that investigators refused to ignore. Police began by reconstructing the simplest question: could she have physically left the building undetected? The residential complex was equipped with surveillance cameras covering entrances, elevators, and surrounding streets. Investigators reviewed footage from the hours during which Sue claimed she departed. They saw delivery drivers, residents returning home, and occasional pedestrians, but no trace of Lai exiting. This absence became the first crack in the narrative. In modern urban investigations, video silence can be as meaningful as visible movement. If she had walked out, it was highly likely she would have appeared somewhere within the camera network. As searches expanded outward, to nearby lakes, green spaces, transportation hubs, investigators simultaneously narrowed inward. They treated the apartment not as a passive background but as an active site requiring microscopic scrutiny. Floors were swabbed, walls were tested, drainage pipes were dismantled. Chemical reagents were applied to surfaces to reveal latent traces of blood invisible to the naked eye. Even when cleaning appears thorough, biological material can seep into grout lines, pipe joints, and microscopic surface imperfections. Water consumption records were retrieved from the apartment's utility data. Analysts observed an unusual spike during the night and morning hours following the disappearance. While high water usage alone does not prove a crime, in context it raised additional questions. What required extended running water during those hours? Was it ordinary domestic activity, or something more sustained and deliberate? The data provided investigators with a temporal anchor that aligned with forensic suspicion. Attention then shifted decisively to the building's plumbing system. In high-rise structures, wastewater travels through vertical stacks before reaching shared septic tanks and ultimately municipal treatment plants. If human remains had been destroyed and flushed, fragments might persist in those systems. The decision to inspect sewage infrastructure was not immediate. It reflected a gradual accumulation of doubt about Sue's account. Once undertaken, however, it transformed the trajectory of the case. Teams opened septic tanks servicing the building. Workers in protective suits sifted through sludge, separating organic debris from inorganic waste. The labor was exhaustive and psychologically taxing. Yet among the refuse, forensic technicians identified tissue fragments inconsistent with typical household waste. Samples were preserved, cataloged, and sent to laboratories for genetic analysis. DNA testing confirmed what investigators had begun to suspect. The fragments belonged to Lai. The missing person case was now definitively a homicide committed within the building. Confronted with this evidence, Sue's position collapsed. During interrogation, he admitted to killing his wife during a domestic dispute. Court findings later stated that the conflict centered on property and financial arrangements. The killing occurred while she slept. What followed was not panic-driven chaos, but a prolonged process of dismemberment in the apartment bathroom. He cut the body into smaller pieces to facilitate disposal. Over hours, he flushed portions through the toilet, relying on water pressure and plumbing to carry evidence away. He cleaned the apartment carefully, attempting to remove visible traces and return the space to normal appearance. Investigators reconstructed the timeline in detail. Surveillance footage documented Sue leaving the building carrying bags during the days after the killing. These outings corresponded with disposal of larger fragments that could not be flushed. Forensic specialists mapped the likely path of remains from the apartment to the septic tank and onward to the treatment facility. Tons of wastewater sludge were examined in order to recover sufficient biological material for definitive identification. The success of this effort underscored the persistence of forensic traces even in systems designed to carry waste away. The case rapidly became one of the most discussed criminal investigations in China in 2020. Public reaction was fueled not only by the brutality, but by the deception displayed in the days following the disappearance. Su had participated in search efforts and given calm media interviews, presenting himself as a concerned spouse. In retrospect, those appearances were interpreted as deliberate attempts to deflect suspicion. The contrast between public composure and private violence amplified the shock. Legal proceedings moved forward with a charge of intentional homicide. Prosecutors emphasized premeditation, cruelty, and calculated concealment. They argued that killing a sleeping spouse, dismembering the body, and systematically disposing of remains demonstrated extreme malice. The Hangzhou Intermediate People's Court agreed, sentencing Su to death. The decision cited the particularly cruel method and severe social impact. After mandatory review, the sentence was upheld and later carried out. Yet the broader impact of the case extended beyond punishment. It exposed how violence can remain hidden within intimate spaces, shielded by walls and routine. Neighbors reported hearing nothing unusual that night. The building's residents had continued daily life unaware that a homicide and dismemberment were unfolding within one apartment. The crime revealed the fragility of assumptions about safety in shared urban environments. Forensic professionals studied the investigation as an example of persistence. The breakthrough did not come from a confession alone, but from refusal to accept an incomplete explanation. Surveillance analysis, water usage data, plumbing inspection, and DNA extraction from sewage combined to dismantle a carefully constructed false narrative. Each step built upon the previous one, demonstrating the layered nature of modern investigative work. The case also sparked discussion about domestic disputes involving property in rapidly developing cities. Rising real estate values can intensify conflicts within blended families, particularly when inheritance and ownership are contested. While such disputes do not inherently lead to violence, unresolved resentment can escalate dangerously. Commentators emphasize the importance of mediation, legal clarity, and early intervention in family conflicts. Psychologically, the crime forced a confrontation with the capacity for calculated concealment. The act was not impulsive chaos, but structured destruction and cleanup. The hours spent cutting, flushing, and cleaning indicated sustained intention. That deliberation weighed heavily in judicial reasoning and public perception alike. Years after the crime, the apartment returned to anonymity within the vast skyline of Hangzhou. Pipes continued to carry water, elevators carried residents up and down, daily routines resumed. Yet the case remained etched in collective memory as a reminder that even the most ordinary settings can conceal extraordinary violence. It illustrated how truth can persist beneath layers of attempted erasure, carried through unseen systems until uncovered by persistence and science. From the first missing person report to the final judicial review, the trajectory of the case traced a path through doubt, forensic innovation, confession, trial, and punishment. It demonstrated that even when a perpetrator attempts to fragment and flush away evidence, microscopic traces endure. In the end, the building's own infrastructure, its cameras, its water meters, its drainage pipes, became silent witnesses, preserving fragments of truth long enough for investigators to assemble them into a complete and devastating narrative. Story 4. In March 2020, in Huyan, Jiangsu Province, a 9-year-old girl disappeared from her home under circumstances that initially appeared uncertain but quickly turned catastrophic. The city, like much of China at the time, was operating under heightened public awareness due to the broader global situation of that year, and community vigilance was already elevated. When the child failed to return home and her whereabouts could not be established, family members contacted authorities. The timeline that followed unfolded rapidly, exposing a sequence of betrayal and violence that shocked the nation. The girl had been living primarily with her mother following her parents' separation. Her mother was in a relationship with a man later identified as Wang Mu. Reports later revealed that tensions had existed between the man and the child. Neighbors described arguments within the household. There were claims that the man had expressed frustration with the child's presence. None of those early concerns, however, had triggered formal intervention before the fatal events. On the day of the disappearance, the mother was reportedly away from the residence for part of the time. The boyfriend was present with the child. According to later court findings, a violent altercation occurred inside the home. The man assaulted the child in a manner so severe that it resulted in fatal injuries. After confirming that she was no longer alive, he attempted to conceal the crime rather than seek medical assistance. The concealment phase unfolded with calculated effort. The body was transported from the residence and hidden in a remote area outside the city. Investigators later determined that the location had been selected deliberately to delay discovery. The terrain was wooded and partially isolated, reducing the likelihood of immediate detection. The man then returned to the residence and attempted to behave as though nothing had occurred. When the child could not be located and contact attempts failed, family members and neighbors grew alarmed. Authorities initiated a search operation. Surveillance footage from surrounding streets was reviewed. Phone location data and transportation records were analyzed. The mother, distressed and increasingly suspicious, cooperated with police. As investigators retraced the boyfriend's movements, inconsistencies began to surface. Surveillance cameras captured his vehicle traveling toward an area inconsistent with routine errands during the critical time frame. Investigators examined his mobile phone's positioning data, which placed him near a wooded zone on the outskirts of Huyen shortly after the time of the child's death. Under questioning, he provided shifting explanations. Initially, he denied involvement. As evidence accumulated, pressure intensified. Police deployed search teams to the wooded location indicated by digital data. Officers combed through brush and uneven ground. It did not take long before they discovered evidence of disturbed soil and unnatural placement of debris. Beneath layers of concealment, they located the body of the child. The condition confirmed violent assault. The discovery transformed the missing persons case into a confirmed homicide investigation. Confronted with the recovery of the body and digital evidence tying him to the disposal site, the suspect eventually confessed. Court records later summarized that he admitted to beating the child in anger, resulting in her death. Rather than call for help, he transported her remains and attempted to hide them to evade responsibility. The confession included acknowledgement of intentional concealment. The brutality of the act, violence against a 9-year-old child, provoked immediate and widespread public condemnation. Social media discussions erupted. Commentators demanded severe punishment. Child protection and domestic abuse advocates emphasized the warning signs that can exist in households involving non-biological caregivers and stressed the need for vigilance and reporting mechanisms. Prosecutors moved swiftly. The case was transferred to the Huyen Intermediate People's Court. Charges included intentional homicide. Aggravating factors cited included the age of the victim, the cruelty of the assault, and the deliberate attempt to conceal the body. Under Chinese criminal law, the murder of a minor under particularly cruel circumstances is eligible for capital punishment. The trial proceedings focused heavily on forensic evidence. Medical examiners testified regarding the cause of death. Digital forensic analysts explained the suspect's phone data and vehicle tracking. Surveillance footage placed him at key locations along the timeline. The prosecution argued that the violence was not accidental but intentional and sustained. The defense sought to frame the incident as an uncontrolled outburst rather than premeditated murder, but the concealment actions undermined claims of impulsivity. The court examined not only the fatal assault, but the subsequent transportation and burial attempt as evidence of consciousness of guilt. Judges emphasized the vulnerability of the victim and the severe social harm caused by the crime. In late 2020, the Huyen Intermediate People's Court issued its verdict. The defendant was found guilty of intentional homicide. The judgment described the act as extremely cruel and socially reprehensible. The court sentenced him to death and deprivation of political rights for life. As required by law, the sentence was submitted to the Supreme People's Court for review. The case reverberated across China. It became emblematic of domestic violence against children and the dangers posed by unstable caregivers. Discussions extended beyond legal punishment to systemic prevention. Commentators urge stronger reporting mechanisms in schools and communities to identify signs of abuse earlier. Others debated sentencing severity and the deterrent effect of capital punishment. Behind the legal proceedings lay a stark human tragedy. A child who had relied on adults for protection had instead encountered lethal violence within her own home. The crime underscored the particular vulnerability of children in domestic settings, where authority figures are unregulated and emotional volatility goes unchecked. As the appellate review process began, the focus shifted from investigation to judicial confirmation. Yet the emotional weight of the case remained present in public consciousness. The brutality of the killing and the attempt to erase evidence ensured that it would be remembered long after the legal system reached its final determination. In the days following the discovery of the child's body in the wooded outskirts of Huyen, investigators intensified their reconstruction of the events that had unfolded inside the apartment during the critical hours before her disappearance. What had initially been treated as a missing child case was now firmly established as a homicide. The focus shifted to building a comprehensive evidentiary chain that could withstand judicial scrutiny. Forensic teams returned to the residence, sealing off rooms and conducting detailed examinations of surfaces, flooring, bedding, and bathroom fixtures. Although attempts had been made to clean the area, trained investigators searched for microscopic traces, blood spatter patterns invisible to the naked eye, fibers transferred during struggle, and any signs indicating the sequence of violence. Chemical reagents were applied to surfaces suspected of having been wiped down. In certain areas, faint luminescent reactions suggested prior presence of blood that had been cleaned. Swabs were collected and sent to laboratories for DNA analysis. Medical examiners later testified that the injuries sustained by the child were consistent with blunt force trauma. The pattern and severity of injuries indicated sustained assault rather than a single accidental strike. This forensic conclusion became central to the prosecution's argument that the act constituted intentional homicide rather than negligent manslaughter. Investigators also analyzed the suspect's vehicle. Soil samples from the tires and undercarriage were collected and compared with soil from the burial site. Forensic comparison demonstrated consistency in mineral composition and organic content, reinforcing the connection between the vehicle and the wooded area where the body was found. Inside the trunk, trace evidence including plant matter and microscopic fibers further tied the vehicle to the disposal location. These findings undermined any remaining denial regarding transportation of the body. Digital forensics played an equally decisive role. Police retrieved the suspect's mobile phone and extracted location data covering the relevant time frame. The device's positioning history placed him first at the residence during the estimated time of death, then traveling along a route toward the outskirts of Huyen, and finally stationary near the remote area where the body was recovered. Analysts presented detailed movement maps showing timestamps and coordinates. Even brief stops along the route were documented, creating a precise timeline that corresponded with surveillance footage from traffic cameras. Traffic monitoring systems in Chinese cities record vehicle movements at major intersections. Investigators accessed these records and identified the suspect's car passing through specific checkpoints at times consistent with the phone data. The convergence of independent digital sources, cellular positioning, and traffic camera captures created a robust evidentiary framework. During interrogation, when confronted with these synchronized data sets, the suspect's initial claims of routine errands began to unravel. Questioning sessions extended over multiple days. At first, he minimized his involvement, suggesting the child had suffered an accidental fall. However, forensic reports detailing multiple blunt force injuries contradicted that explanation. As contradictions accumulated, the suspect ultimately confessed. According to court summaries later presented during trial, he admitted that anger and frustration had escalated into violence. He struck the child repeatedly during an argument. When she stopped responding, he realized she was dead. Instead of contacting emergency services, he focused on concealing the crime to avoid legal consequences. The concealment required calculated steps. He waited for a period during which the residents would not draw attention, then transported the body in his vehicle under cover of darkness. He selected a remote location known to him, possibly from prior visits, where vegetation and uneven terrain would make discovery less likely. After burying or partially concealing the body, he returned home and attempted to resume normal behavior. He did not report an accident. He did not seek medical intervention. Instead, he allowed hours to pass before authorities were notified of the child's absence. Prosecutors later emphasized this sequence to demonstrate consciousness of guilt. In court, they argued that the decision to transport and hide the body rather than seek assistance indicated deliberate intent to evade detection. Under Chinese criminal law, post-crime concealment and obstruction can serve as aggravating factors during sentencing, particularly when combined with violence against a minor. The Huyan Intermediate People's Court convened to hear the case later in 2020. Due to the age of the victim and the sensitive nature of the crime, proceedings were not broadly publicized in real time, but official summaries were released after the verdict. During trial, medical examiners described the injuries in clinical detail, explaining how the pattern of trauma ruled out accident. Digital forensic experts walked the court through the extraction of phone data and vehicle tracking records. Investigators testified regarding the recovery of soil and fiber evidence linking the vehicle to the burial site. The defense attempted to frame the assault as a momentary loss of control, arguing lack of premeditation. However, the prosecution countered that even if the initial assault began impulsively, the subsequent decisions, transporting the body, hiding it, misleading investigators, demonstrated sustained intentional conduct. Judges considered not only the fatal assault, but the entire chain of actions from violence to concealment. Public reaction continued to intensify throughout the judicial process. Commentators expressed outrage that a caregiver figure could commit such violence against a child. Advocacy groups highlighted the importance of recognizing warning signs in blended family dynamics. Some discussions centered on whether neighbors or relatives had noticed earlier indicators of hostility within the household, and whether intervention could have altered the outcome. The tragedy sparked renewed debate about domestic abuse reporting systems and child welfare oversight. By late 2020, the court delivered its judgment. The defendant was convicted of intentional homicide. The written verdict emphasized the particularly cruel nature of the assault, the vulnerability of the victim, and the deliberate attempt to conceal the crime. The court sentenced him to death and deprivation of political rights for life. The judgment noted that the crime had caused severe social harm and aroused strong public indignation. As mandated by law, the death sentence was submitted to the Supreme People's Court for review. During this period, legal documentation, including confession records, forensic reports, digital data analyses, and trial transcripts, was forwarded for examination. The review process ensured that the evidentiary chain met national standards and that procedural safeguards had been respected throughout investigation and trial. While awaiting final confirmation, the case remained deeply embedded in public discourse. It was frequently cited in media discussions about child protection, domestic violence, and the responsibilities of non-biological guardians. Schools and community organizations referenced the tragedy in conversations about safeguarding mechanisms. Although the judicial phase was nearing conclusion, the societal implications continued to ripple outward. The investigation had begun with uncertainty, a child missing from her home. It evolved through digital tracking, forensic science, confession, and courtroom adjudication into a definitive narrative of intentional violence. Each evidentiary layer reinforced the next, constructing a case that left little ambiguity about responsibility. The appellate review would determine the final legal outcome, but by the close of the trial phase, the factual structure of the crime was firmly established. An act of lethal violence against a 9-year-old child, followed by calculated concealment, uncovered through persistent investigative work, and corroborated by digital and forensic evidence. Following the death sentence issued by the Huyan Intermediate People's Court in late 2020, the case entered the mandatory capital review process required under Chinese law. Every death sentence handed down by an intermediate court must be examined and approved by the Supreme People's Court before it can be carried out. This review is not symbolic. It functions as a comprehensive reassessment of factual findings, evidentiary sufficiency, legal interpretation, and procedural compliance. In cases involving minors and particularly violent acts, the scrutiny is especially exacting. The full case file, including interrogation transcripts, forensic reports, digital location data analyses, medical examiner findings, trial testimony, and the written judgment, was transmitted to Beijing for review. The Supreme People's Court evaluates whether the facts are clear, whether evidence was lawfully obtained, whether the defendant's rights were preserved, and whether the punishment aligns with statutory guidelines for intentional homicide. In this case, the lower court had emphasized several aggravating factors: the victim's young age, the brutality of the assault, and the deliberate attempt to conceal the body after the killing. The appellate documentation outlined the sequence of events reconstructed by investigators. It described how the fatal assault occurred within the residence in Huyan, how blunt force trauma caused the child's death, and how the defendant subsequently transported the body to a wooded area outside the city. It detailed how surveillance systems captured the vehicle's route, and how mobile phone positioning data corroborated that movement. The file included soil comparison reports linking the suspect's vehicle to the burial site, and laboratory confirmations of blood traces found in the apartment after cleaning attempts. The Supreme People's Court does not typically rehear testimony in a public forum. Rather, it conducts a document-based review supplemented by internal legal analysis. In capital cases, judges assess whether mitigating factors exist and whether the lower court correctly weighed aggravating circumstances. Defense submissions, if any, are considered during this process. In some cases, sentences may be reduced to suspended death sentences or life imprisonment if mitigating elements are deemed substantial. In this case, however, the aggravating factors were significant. Official summaries released after review confirmed that the Supreme People's Court upheld the death sentence. The ruling concluded that the facts were clear, the evidence reliable and sufficient, the conviction accurate, and the sentencing appropriate. It affirmed that the murder of a 9-year-old child under such violent circumstances constituted an especially serious offense with profound social harm. Following approval, the sentence moved into the enforcement phase according to legal procedure. The confirmation of the death sentence reignited national discussion. While public outrage at the crime had been immediate from the moment details emerged, the appellate affirmation solidified the legal conclusion. Commentators framed the case as an example of zero tolerance for extreme violence against children. Others revisited earlier debates about prevention rather than punishment, arguing that while capital sentencing addressed accountability, systemic safeguards must focus on identifying domestic instability before it escalates into fatal harm. In Huyan, the crime left a lingering psychological impact. Residents expressed disbelief that such violence had unfolded within a household setting. Teachers and community leaders held discussions about child safety awareness. The tragedy prompted some local initiatives aimed at encouraging neighbors, relatives, and school officials to report warning signs of abuse more quickly. Though the legal chapter was nearing closure, the social reverberations persisted. From a legal standpoint, the case reinforced how digital infrastructure has reshaped homicide investigations. The integration of traffic camera networks, mobile phone location tracking, and forensic soil analysis provided a multi-layered evidentiary matrix. Even if no eyewitness directly observed the transportation of the body, technological footprints created a silent but precise record. Courts increasingly rely on such converging data streams to establish timelines beyond reasonable doubt. Psychologically, analysts examined the pattern of escalation described in the confession. Reports indicated that frustration and anger preceded the assault, but what distinguished the case legally was not only the violence itself, but the decision to conceal it. The act of transporting and hiding the body indicated a transition from uncontrolled aggression to deliberate evasion. That transition became central to judicial reasoning in upholding the most severe penalty available. The mother of the child, though not implicated in the homicide, endured intense public scrutiny and personal grief. Media commentary often emphasized the vulnerability of children in environments where a non-biological adult assumes authority without formal oversight. Advocacy groups used the case to argue for clearer mechanisms of monitoring and reporting within blended families, especially when prior conflicts are visible to neighbors or relatives. After the Supreme People's Court's approval, enforcement procedures were carried out in accordance with national regulations. Although detailed information about execution logistics is not typically publicized, official reporting confirmed that the sentence had been implemented following legal protocol. The judicial process, from investigation through trial, appeal, and final enforcement, had concluded. Yet even with legal finality, the case continued to serve as a cautionary reference point. Training materials for law enforcement cited the importance of immediate digital data preservation in missing child cases. Legal scholars referenced the appellate affirmation when discussing standards for capital punishment in crimes against minors. Social commentators revisited the tragedy during discussions of domestic abuse awareness campaigns. What began as a missing child report evolved into a multi-layered criminal proceeding that exposed both the fragility of domestic safety and the strength of forensic systems designed to uncover truth. The integration of physical evidence, digital tracking, confession, and judicial review demonstrated a structured pathway from uncertainty to accountability. The emotional weight of the case, however, remained centered on a single fact. A 9-year-old child lost her life in an environment that should have protected her. That reality continued to resonate long after the final judicial document was signed. In retrospect, the final stage of the case cannot be understood without revisiting the earliest investigative decisions made in the first 48 hours after the child was reported missing. Those early hours shaped everything that followed. When officers in Huyen received the initial report, they treated it with urgency. Missing child cases in China trigger rapid response protocols, especially when circumstances suggest the child did not leave voluntarily. Patrol officers canvassed the immediate neighborhood. Officers knocked on doors, reviewed nearby surveillance cameras, and began constructing a minute-by-minute timeline of the child's last confirmed movements. Inside the apartment, investigators looked for signs of struggle. Although no dramatic scene greeted them, subtle irregularities raised questions. Certain items appeared displaced in ways inconsistent with routine activity. Cleaning supplies were unusually prominent. Forensic technicians collected swabs from floors and walls, even when surfaces appeared spotless. Later laboratory results would detect diluted biological traces consistent with blood, supporting medical findings that the fatal assault had occurred inside the residence. Simultaneously, Analysts examined digital data. In modern Chinese cities, public security systems integrate traffic monitoring, community cameras, and telecommunications positioning. Investigators requested access to traffic checkpoint records, which log vehicles passing major intersections. The suspect's car appeared on several cameras during the relevant timeframe, traveling away from residential areas toward less populated outskirts. That direction alone was not conclusive, but it diverged from his stated explanation of routine errands. Mobile phone data proved decisive. Telecommunications providers maintain records of cell tower connections, allowing approximate reconstruction of movement. Analysts mapped the suspect's device location during the hours after the child's estimated time of death. The phone traveled from the apartment to a remote wooded region and remained stationary there for a period. It then returned to the city. The duration of the stop corresponded with the estimated time required to conceal a body. Armed with these data points, police organized a coordinated ground search of the identified wooded zone. Officers navigated uneven terrain, scanning for disturbed earth, displaced vegetation, or anomalies inconsistent with natural surroundings. Searchers eventually discovered an area where soil appeared recently turned. Upon excavation, they located the child's body. The discovery confirmed that the digital trail had accurately reflected physical reality. Medical examiners conducted a detailed autopsy. The injuries documented were consistent with repeated blunt force trauma. Experts concluded that death resulted from intentional violence rather than accident. In court, this forensic testimony dismantled claims of an unintended fatal outcome. The severity and multiplicity of injuries demonstrated sustained assault. Back at the apartment, forensic comparison between soil from the burial site and residue found in the suspect's vehicle strengthened the evidentiary chain. Even microscopic mineral similarities were presented during trial to illustrate how the vehicle had transported material from the wooded location. Such comparative forensic techniques have become increasingly precise, enabling investigators to match environmental samples across distances. The interrogation phase was equally methodical. Initially, the suspect attempted partial explanations, suggesting an accidental injury. However, confronted with synchronized digital and forensic evidence, his account shifted. The confession that followed acknowledged anger, violence, and deliberate concealment. Prosecutors later emphasized that concealment was not an afterthought, but an extended process involving transportation, burial, and misdirection. When the Huyan Intermediate People's Court evaluated the case, judges considered not only the act of killing, but the vulnerability of the victim and the betrayal of trust inherent in the caregiver role. Under Chinese criminal law, intentional homicide involving particularly cruel means or targeting minors can warrant the most severe penalty. The death sentence reflected the court's determination that aggravating factors overwhelmingly outweighed any mitigating claims. After the Supreme People's Court upheld the sentence, enforcement followed established legal procedures. Official reporting confirmed that the judicial process had been completed in accordance with statutory requirements. The conclusion of the case marked the end of legal proceedings, but not the end of its broader influence. In the years following 2020, the tragedy remained a reference point in national discussions about child protection. Advocacy groups cited it when urging improved reporting mechanisms for suspected domestic abuse. Educational institutions incorporated child safety awareness programs, emphasizing that early signs of hostility within household should not be ignored. Community committees discussed the importance of neighbors reporting unusual disturbances involving children. Law enforcement agencies also drew operational lessons from the case. The integration of traffic monitoring systems and telecommunications data demonstrated how quickly digital footprints can reconstruct events. Missing child investigations increasingly emphasize rapid preservation of such data, recognizing that early retrieval can prevent loss of critical timestamps. The Huyen case illustrated how technology, when combined with traditional ground search methods, can narrow search areas and accelerate discovery. The psychological dimension of the crime continued to be examined by criminologists. They analyzed how domestic stress, unmanaged anger, and resentment can escalate when no external oversight intervenes. They also emphasized that violence against children often occurs within closed environments where victims lack independent means of reporting abuse. Preventative frameworks therefore require vigilance from extended family members, schools, and community networks. For the city of Huyen, the memory of the crime lingered quietly. Life resumed, but the knowledge that such violence had occurred within an ordinary apartment building left an imprint. Residents became more attentive to warning signs. Conversations about safeguarding children became more open. The tragedy had forced a collective reckoning with the reality that harm can arise not from strangers but from individuals within the domestic sphere. Ultimately, the case followed a clear arc: a missing child report, meticulous investigation, forensic confirmation, confession, trial, appellate review, and enforcement of sentence. Each stage demonstrated the structured progression of the criminal justice system in response to extreme violence. Digital infrastructure, forensic science, and procedural safeguards combined to establish accountability beyond reasonable doubt. At its core, however, the story remains centered on the loss of a 9-year-old life. Beyond legal terminology and investigative detail lies a stark reminder of vulnerability. The judicial process delivered punishment, but prevention remains the enduring challenge. The case stands as both a record of crime and a catalyst for reflection on vigilance, responsibility, and the mechanisms necessary to protect those who cannot protect themselves. Story 5. In January 2020, the disappearance of 11-year-old Gannon Stauch from his home in Colorado Springs began as a missing child case that quickly escalated into one of the most closely followed criminal investigations in the United States that year. Gannon lived with his father, his stepmother Letitia Stauch, and his younger sister. His father was an active-duty member of the U.S. Army and had been temporarily assigned out of state at the time of the events. On January 27, 2020, Gannon was reported missing. According to Letitia, he had left the house earlier that afternoon to visit a friend and had not returned. When deputies from the El Paso County Sheriff's Office responded, the initial scenario presented was that of a runaway or missing child. From the outset, inconsistencies emerged. Surveillance footage from the neighborhood showed Gannon leaving the home earlier that day with Letitia in her vehicle. Later footage captured her returning alone. No camera showed Gannon walking away from the house to visit a friend, as she claimed. When questioned, Letitia's explanations shifted. She suggested he might have been abducted. She floated the possibility of a suspicious man. She implied that perhaps Gannon had been involved in something she did not understand. Each version differed from the last, and investigators began to focus more closely on her statements. Search operations expanded rapidly. Hundreds of volunteers, deputies, and search and rescue teams combed through parks, open spaces, and neighborhoods. Drones were deployed. K-9 units were brought in. The case drew national media attention, in part because of the emotional pleas made by Gannon's biological mother and father. Community members organized vigils. Flyers were distributed across the city. For days, the working assumption was that the child might still be alive. Inside the home, however, forensic investigators were quietly building a different narrative. Blood evidence was discovered in Gannon's bedroom. Although attempts had been made to clean the area, chemical reagents revealed stains consistent with significant blood loss. Investigators collected carpet samples, mattress materials, and bedding for laboratory analysis. The volume and distribution of the blood suggested that a violent assault had occurred inside the house. Vehicle data provided additional clues. Letitia's Volkswagen Tiguan was examined. Investigators found evidence of blood in the vehicle, as well as on items stored inside. GPS data and vehicle telematics showed that on the day Gannon disappeared, the car had traveled not only around Colorado Springs, but also to a remote area near Highway 105. This contradicted her statements that she had merely run errands. As pressure mounted, Letitia left Colorado with Gannon's younger sister, traveling first to South Carolina, where she had family ties. The timing of her departure raised further suspicion. Law enforcement agencies coordinated across state lines. While she was away, investigators continued processing the house and vehicle, piecing together a timeline that increasingly suggested homicide rather than disappearance. In March 2020, nearly 2 months after Gannon was reported missing, construction workers in Pace, Florida discovered a suitcase beneath a bridge along Highway 90. Inside were human remains. Dental records later confirmed that the body was Gannon Stauch. The discovery transformed the case definitively into a homicide investigation with interstate implications. The distance between Colorado and Florida, over 1,000 miles, revealed the extent of the effort taken to conceal the crime. Prosecutors would later allege that on January 27, 2020, Letitia attacked Gannon inside the home. Court documents described a brutal sequence involving blunt force trauma, stabbing, and ultimately a gunshot. The blood evidence in the bedroom corresponded with these allegations. After the killing, she reportedly transported the body in her vehicle, initially disposing of it in a remote area in Colorado before later retrieving it, driving across state lines, and ultimately discarding it in Florida. The interstate movement complicated the investigation, but also strengthened the evidentiary chain. Surveillance cameras captured her vehicle along highways. Rental car records showed that she had rented another vehicle during the critical period. Cell phone data placed her in locations consistent with the disposal route. Each data point narrowed the margin for alternative explanations. In early March 2020, authorities arrested Letitia Stauch in South Carolina. She was charged with first-degree murder, child abuse resulting in death, tampering with a deceased human body, and additional related offenses. She was extradited to Colorado to face trial. During press conferences, law enforcement officials described the case as one of the most disturbing they had handled. As details emerged through affidavits and court filings, the public learned more about the alleged attempts at deception. Investigators reported that Letitia had provided multiple conflicting stories, including claims of kidnapping and accidental injury. She had conducted media interviews proclaiming innocence, at times portraying herself as a victim of suspicion. Yet forensic science, digital data, and the recovery of Gannon's body steadily dismantled those narratives. The autopsy findings were devastating. Medical examiners documented multiple forms of trauma. The combination of blunt force injuries, sharp force wounds, and a gunshot wound indicated sustained and escalating violence. Prosecutors argued that the killing was intentional, and that the subsequent transportation of the body across state lines demonstrated calculated concealment. The arrest marked the end of the search phase but the beginning of a prolonged legal process. Pretrial proceedings extended over years, involving competency evaluations, motions regarding evidence, and debates over mental health defenses. The case would not reach trial until 2023, but the crime itself belonged to 2020, a year already marked by upheaval across the country. Within that broader national turbulence, the murder of an 11-year-old boy by a trusted caregiver stood out as a particularly chilling betrayal. What began as a missing child report had evolved into a multi-state homicide case involving extensive forensic reconstruction and digital tracking. The quiet suburban home in Colorado Springs had concealed a violent act. The highways stretching eastward carried not only a vehicle but a crime scene in motion. And beneath a Florida bridge, thousands of miles from where he lived, the truth had ultimately surfaced. As the investigation intensified in early 2020, Authorities in Colorado Springs began reconstructing January 27 with minute precision. What initially appeared to be a missing child timeline increasingly resembled a contained domestic crime scene. Surveillance footage from neighbors proved critical. Video showed Gannon Stauch entering his stepmother's vehicle with her earlier that afternoon. Later footage showed the vehicle returning, but Gannon did not exit. That discrepancy alone fundamentally undermined the claim that he had later walked away from the house to visit a friend. Inside the home, forensic processing continued for days. Investigators removed sections of carpet from Gannon's bedroom and collected samples from walls and bedding. Chemical enhancement revealed a pattern of blood staining inconsistent with minor injury. Laboratory analysis later confirmed that the blood belonged to Gannon. The distribution suggested movement within the room, as if an injured person had attempted to shift position. Prosecutors would later argue that the quantity of blood indicated injuries that would have rendered survival impossible without immediate medical intervention. Vehicle examination yielded equally damaging findings. In Letitia Stauch's Volkswagen Tiguan, investigators located blood traces in the rear cargo area. They also discovered a particle board panel that appeared to have been used as a temporary surface liner. Fibers and biological material consistent with Gannon were identified. GPS data from the vehicle revealed travel to a remote area near Palmer Lake, north of Colorado Springs, on the day of the disappearance. Authorities theorized that this was an initial attempt to conceal the body before later relocation. Digital evidence became a central pillar of the case. Investigators analyzed Letitia's cell phone records, internet search history, and text messages. Court affidavits later indicated searches related to cleaning blood and moving bodies. Although defense attorneys would later challenge interpretation of some digital data, prosecutors maintained that the pattern of searches aligned closely with the timeline of events. Additionally, rental car records showed that she rented a Nissan Altima shortly after reporting Gannon missing. That vehicle was driven cross-country, further complicating the case geographically, but also creating a traceable path. The recovery of Gannon's remains in March 2020 in Pace, Florida, provided the physical confirmation investigators needed. Construction workers discovered a suitcase beneath a bridge along Highway 90. Inside were the remains later identified as Gannon. The location placed the disposal site more than 1,400 miles from Colorado. Authorities determined that Letitia had transported the body across multiple states. Surveillance systems along highways captured images of her vehicle at various tolls and interchanges. Cell phone pings corroborated the route. The autopsy findings were harrowing. Medical examiners documented blunt force trauma, multiple stab wounds, and a gunshot wound. The combination suggested escalating violence rather than a single impulsive act. Prosecutors alleged that Gannon had suffered injuries inside his bedroom before being shot. The presence of blood spatter consistent with gunshot trauma inside the house reinforced this theory. The layering of injury types became central to establishing intent. In March 2020, Letitia was arrested in South Carolina and charged with first-degree murder, child abuse resulting in death, tampering with a deceased human body, and other related offenses. During early court appearances, she maintained her innocence. Over time, her defense strategy evolved. Motions were filed requesting mental health evaluations. The court ordered competency assessments to determine whether she was fit to stand trial. These proceedings delayed the case significantly. Throughout 2020 and into 2021, prosecutors continued refining the evidentiary narrative. They reconstructed the sequence of alleged events: an assault inside the bedroom, fatal injuries inflicted, temporary concealment in Colorado, later retrieval of the body, interstate transport, and final disposal in Florida. Each phase was supported by physical evidence, digital tracking, and witness testimony. The prosecution emphasized not only the act of killing, but the calculated effort to mislead investigators and the public. Public attention remained intense. Media coverage replayed interviews Letitia had given during the search phase, in which she denied wrongdoing and suggested alternative scenarios including kidnapping. Those statements, contrasted with forensic findings, shaped public perception of deliberate deception. Gannon's biological mother, Landon Hewitt, and his father spoke publicly about their grief, reinforcing the emotional weight of the proceedings. Pretrial hearings addressed admissibility of evidence, including digital searches and statements made to law enforcement. Defense attorneys signaled an intention to pursue an insanity defense, arguing that Letitia was experiencing severe mental health disturbances at the time of the killing. Prosecutors countered that her actions, cleaning the scene, transporting the body, renting vehicles, crossing state lines, demonstrated organized and purposeful behavior inconsistent with legal insanity. By late 2022, the case was formally scheduled for trial in 2023. The gap between the crime and trial reflected the complexity of forensic review and mental health litigation. Throughout this period, Gannon's case remained a reference point in discussions about child abuse, caregiver accountability, and forensic investigation. The evidence assembled painted a comprehensive picture: biological traces in the bedroom and vehicle, GPS data charting movement to remote locations, rental car documentation establishing interstate travel, surveillance imagery from highways, and autopsy findings detailing multiple fatal injuries. Individually, each element raised suspicion. Collectively, they formed a cohesive narrative of homicide followed by calculated concealment. As the trial date approached, the central legal question shifted from whether Gannon had been killed, evidence strongly established that he had, to whether Letitia Stauch was criminally responsible under the law or legally insane at the time of the offense. That determination would ultimately rest with a jury. The trial of Letitia Stauch began in April 2023 in El Paso County, Colorado, nearly 3 years after the killing of Gannon Stauch. Court proceedings unfolded inside the El Paso County Courthouse in Colorado Springs, where prosecutors laid out what they described as a calculated and methodical murder followed by elaborate attempts at deception. The courtroom atmosphere was heavy from the outset. Gannon's family sat only feet away from the woman accused of killing him, while jurors prepared to absorb weeks of graphic testimony, digital evidence, and psychiatric evaluations that would define one of the most closely followed criminal cases in the region. In opening statements, the prosecution told jurors that this case was not about accident or temporary loss of control, but about deliberate violence and conscious cover-up. They outlined a sequence beginning with an assault inside Gannon's bedroom on January 27, 2020, escalating into fatal injuries, and followed by staged attempts to suggest he had left the home voluntarily. Prosecutors emphasized surveillance footage showing Gannon leaving the house with Letitia earlier that afternoon and returning, but never being seen alive again. They reminded jurors that she was the last known person with him. The defense countered by signaling their reliance on a plea of not guilty by reason of insanity, arguing that Letitia suffered from severe mental illness that impaired her ability to distinguish right from wrong at the time of the offense. Forensic experts testified in meticulous detail. Crime scene analysts described the blood evidence recovered from Gannon's bedroom. Chemical enhancement had revealed patterns invisible to the naked eye: transfer stains, impact spatter, and pooled blood beneath carpet fibers. Experts explained how the distribution suggested movement after injury, and how the volume of blood was inconsistent with survival. They also described the discovery of a bullet hole in the bedroom wall and the trajectory analysis that followed. Firearms specialists testified that the bullet recovered was consistent with a handgun accessible within the home. Medical examiners then presented autopsy findings that deeply affected the courtroom. Gannon had sustained blunt force trauma to the head, multiple stab wounds, and a gunshot wound. The medical examiner described each injury type and explained how the combination reflected escalating violence. Jurors were shown diagrams and clinical photographs to contextualize the testimony. The cause of death was ruled homicide. Prosecutors argued that the multiplicity of injuries showed sustained intent rather than impulsive harm. Digital forensic analysts followed. They presented cell phone data, internet search records, and GPS tracking information. The jury saw maps charting vehicle movements from Colorado to Florida. Analysts explained how Letitia's phone connected to cellular towers along a route that corresponded with the eventual discovery of Gannon's remains in Pace, Florida. They detailed rental car records and timestamped surveillance images capturing her vehicle at various points during interstate travel. The prosecution argued that these movements were not random travel, but part of a calculated effort to conceal the body. Investigators also played portions of recorded interviews in which Letitia had denied involvement and suggested alternative scenarios, including kidnapping. Prosecutors highlighted inconsistencies between those statements and forensic evidence. They argued that the evolving explanations reflected consciousness of guilt. Jurors listened as detectives described the initial missing person phase and how suspicions intensified as evidence accumulated. When the defense began presenting its case, the focus shifted dramatically toward mental health. Psychiatrists and psychologists testified about Letitia's psychological history. Defense experts diagnosed her with dissociative identity disorder and other severe psychiatric conditions. They described alleged alternate personalities and episodes of dissociation that, in their opinion, could have impaired her awareness during the offense. The defense argued that, although the acts were horrific, her mental state rendered her legally insane under Colorado law. The prosecution rebutted with its own psychiatric experts, who testified that despite mental health symptoms, Letitia demonstrated organized behavior immediately after the crime. They pointed to her efforts to clean the scene, transport the body, rent vehicles, and cross state lines as evidence of rational planning. They argued that these actions showed awareness of wrongdoing and attempts to avoid detection, key elements contradicting an insanity claim. Under Colorado's legal standard, the question was whether she knew right from wrong at the time of the crime. Prosecutors insisted the evidence showed she did. Throughout the trial, the jury heard testimony about the suitcase in which Gannon's remains were found beneath a Florida bridge. They heard about fiber evidence, DNA analysis, and the recovery process. The physical reality of the disposal site contrasted sharply with the earlier narrative of a missing child. The prosecution framed this as the final act in a deliberate chain of concealment. Emotions surged during victim impact testimony, presented in later phases of proceedings. Gannon's mother and father described his personality, his interests, and the devastation left in the wake of his death. They spoke of the months spent searching, the shock of forensic revelations, and the ongoing trauma. Courtroom observers noted visible reactions among jurors as they listened. After weeks of testimony, closing arguments crystallized the opposing narratives. Prosecutors described the case as one built on science, digital tracking, and behavior that demonstrated intent. They argued that insanity was incompatible with the systematic steps taken to evade responsibility. The defense urged jurors to focus on psychiatric testimony and to consider whether severe mental illness fractured Letitia's perception of reality during the killing. Jury deliberations began in May 2023. The panel reviewed forensic exhibits, psychiatric evaluations, and recorded interviews. The central issue was not whether Gannon had been killed by Letitia, that linkage was strongly supported, but whether she met the legal threshold for insanity. When the verdict was read, the courtroom fell silent. The jury found Letitia Stauch guilty of first-degree murder and additional charges. They rejected the insanity defense. The verdict meant that under Colorado law, she would face life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. The decision closed the trial phase but did not erase the trauma that began in January 2020. The case had moved from missing child investigation to forensic reconstruction to psychological examination and finally to conviction. It underscored how digital evidence, forensic science, and legal standards intersect in modern criminal proceedings. In June 2023, the courtroom in Colorado Springs once again filled with reporters, family members, and court officials as sentencing proceedings began for Letitia Stauch in the murder of Gannon Stauch. The guilty verdict delivered weeks earlier had already determined that she would spend the remainder of her life in prison, but sentencing formalized the judgment and provided an opportunity for the court and the family to speak directly about the magnitude of the crime. The judge reviewed the counts: first-degree murder, child abuse resulting in death, tampering with a deceased human body, and related charges tied to the concealment and transport of Gannon's remains across state lines. Under Colorado law, the conviction for first-degree murder carried a mandatory sentence of life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. Before the sentence was imposed, victim impact statements were read. Gannon's mother described the unbearable silence left in her son's absence, the birthdays that would pass without him, and the daily reality of grief that would never fully fade. She spoke about the hope she once carried during the initial search, the disbelief as evidence mounted, and the pain of learning the details of his injuries. His father addressed the court as well, describing Gannon as a child who loved video games, who enjoyed small adventures, and who trusted the adults in his life. The words in the courtroom were not theatrical. They were measured and steady, but the weight of them was unmistakable. The sentencing phase transformed the legal record into something deeply personal, reminding everyone present that behind forensic charts and psychiatric evaluations was a 10-year-old child whose life had been violently ended. The prosecution reiterated that the murder involved multiple forms of violence: blunt force trauma, stabbing, and a gunshot wound, and that it was followed by calculated attempts to erase evidence and mislead investigators. They emphasized that after killing Gannon, Letitia had cleaned portions of the scene, moved his body, and eventually transported it over 1,400 miles to Florida before discarding it beneath a bridge. These actions, they argued, demonstrated consciousness of guilt and sustained intent to avoid accountability. The judge echoed aspects of that reasoning, noting the prolonged nature of the harm and the extraordinary steps taken to conceal it. When Letitia was given the opportunity to speak, her remarks were closely watched. She maintained that she was not criminally responsible and referenced her mental health, reiterating themes raised during trial. There was no full acknowledgement of responsibility. The contrast between her statements and the jury's rejection of the insanity defense underscored the finality of the verdict. The court, however, was not there to revisit guilt. It was there to impose sentence. The judge formally sentenced Letitia Stauch to life in prison without the possibility of parole for first-degree murder, along with additional consecutive sentences on the remaining counts. The sentence ensured she would spend the rest of her life in the custody of the Colorado Department of Corrections. With the strike of the gavel, the criminal proceedings entered their final stage. Outside the courthouse, statements continued. Prosecutors described the case as one defined by overwhelming forensic evidence and the perseverance of investigators who followed digital and physical clues across multiple states. Law enforcement officials reflected on the early days of the search in January 2020, when the case was still treated as a missing child investigation. They described how quickly suspicion shifted as blood evidence, surveillance footage, and phone data began to contradict public statements made by Letitia. What began as community search efforts ultimately transformed into a coordinated homicide investigation spanning Colorado and Florida. The broader aftermath of the case extended beyond the courtroom. In Colorado Springs, residents remembered the candlelight vigils held during the initial search. Schools and community organizations that had rallied to distribute flyers and share updates were forced to reconcile hope with devastating reality once Gannon's body was found. The case prompted renewed discussions about child protection, mandatory reporting, and the complexities of abuse occurring within trusted family structures. Experts pointed to the role of forensic science, particularly digital tracking and blood pattern analysis, in securing the conviction. The trial demonstrated how modern investigations increasingly rely on metadata, surveillance networks, and interstate cooperation. For Gannon's family, however, the conclusion of legal proceedings did not equate to closure in any simple sense. In interviews after sentencing, they spoke about focusing on honoring his memory rather than allowing the perpetrator's name to define his story. They described establishing memorial efforts and maintaining private rituals to remember him. The emphasis shifted from court transcripts and evidentiary exhibits to remembrance of a child who had loved simple routines and ordinary joys. The case also remained a point of analysis within legal and psychiatric communities. The insanity defense, though rare and difficult to prove, became a central focus of discussion. Mental health professionals debated the standards applied in Colorado courts and the distinctions between diagnosed disorders and legal insanity. Prosecutors cited the jury's decision as confirmation that organized concealment can strongly undermine claims of incapacity. Defense advocates pointed to the importance of thorough psychiatric evaluation, even when outcomes do not favor the defendant. The trial thus contributed to ongoing discourse about how the justice system navigates severe mental illness allegations in violent crime cases. Years after January 27, 2020, the timeline of events remained stark. A child last seen entering a vehicle, a bedroom containing hidden blood evidence, a cross-country drive, a suitcase beneath a Florida bridge, and ultimately a courtroom verdict. The narrative that unfolded was not built on speculation but on layered evidence: biological traces, GPS data, rental car records, ballistic analysis, and testimony from multiple disciplines. Each component formed part of a mosaic that the jury ultimately found compelling beyond a reasonable doubt. The sentencing closed the formal chapter of the state of Colorado versus Letitia Stauch. Yet the human impact persists. For the community of Colorado Springs, the name Gannon Stauch became synonymous with both tragedy and the determination of investigators to pursue truth across state lines. For his family, the focus now rests on remembrance, healing, and ensuring that his life, not only the circumstances of his death, is what endures. Thank you for joining me here at Mr. Midnight. True crime stories remind us of life's mysteries and the importance of staying aware even as we seek comfort in the quiet of the night. Let the rain carry you to a peaceful sleep, and until we meet again, stay safe, stay curious.